All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's meeting. It's now 6 o'clock, Mr. Chair, and we have started the YouTube feed. If it's all right with you, I'm just going to quickly verify quorum and let everyone know who's joining us this evening. So we do, thank you. We do have quorum, and we are currently missing Councillor Hutchison. I hope he will be joining us shortly. And we also have in attendance this evening with staff members are Paige Agnew, Commissioner, Community Services, Tim Park, Acting Director of Planning Services, James Barr, Acting Manager, Development Approvals, Sukriti Agarwal, Acting Manager, Policy Planning, Laura Flaherty, Project Manager for Planning Services, Ian Semple, Director of Transportation Services, Greg McLean, Policy and Program Coordinator for Transportation Services, and Brent Totterin is joining us as a consultant for the city. At this time, Mr. Chair, we do have 14 members of the public joining us in the gallery.
Thank you very much. This meeting tonight, in fact, is just an introduction to the proposed comprehensive zoning bylaw. I'm going to read the notice of collection, but because there is no recommendation tonight and no actionable items tonight other than the presentation, most of this doesn't apply for tonight, but I will read it anyway. Personal information collected as a result of this public hearing and process is collected under the authority of the Planning Act and will be used to assist in making a decision on this matter. All names, addresses, opinions, and comments may be collected and may form part of the minutes, which will be available to the public. Questions regarding this collection should be forwarded to the Director of Planning Services. The purpose of public meetings is to present planning applications in a public forum as required by the Planning Act. Following presentations by the applicant, committee members will be afforded an opportunity to ask questions for clarification and further information. The meeting will then be open to the public for comments and questions. Interested persons are requested to give their name and address for recording in the minutes. Interested members of the public can email the committee clerk or the assigned planner if they wish to be notified regarding a particular application. No decisions are made at public meetings concerning applications unless otherwise noted. The public meeting is held to gather public opinion. No decisions are made at public meetings concerning applications unless otherwise noted. The public meeting is held to gather public opinion. Sorry, I'm repeating myself. An exception to this rule is combined reports, which consolidates the public meeting and comprehensive reports. These applications are deemed by staff as straightforward and routine. This business practice has been in place for a number of years and is received by the applicants as efficient customer service and effective use of committee time. Please note that staff use discretion in determining if an application can be a combined public meeting comprehensive report to expedite the approval process. Public meeting reports are provided to inform the public of all relevant information. Information gathered is then referred back to planning service staff for the preparation of a comprehensive report and recommendation to planning committee. This means that after the meeting tonight, staff will be considering the comments made by the public in their further review of the applications. When the review is completed, a report will be prepared, making a recommendation for action to this committee. The recommendation is typically to approve with conditions or to deny. This committee then makes a recommendation on the applications to City Council. City Council has the final say on the applications from the city perspective. Following council decision, Notice will be circulated in accordance with the Planning Act. If a person or public body would otherwise have the ability to appeal the decision of the Council of the Corporation of the City of Kingston to the local planning appeal tribunal, but that person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the City of Kingston before the bylaw is passed, that person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision. Now, I will now turn this over to staff who will be introducing the most current draft of our upcoming comprehensive zoning bylaw. And I believe that's probably Laura. So the floor is yours, Laura.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of Planning Committee, all of the members of public who have joined us for the public evening tonight. Elizabeth, if I could get you to please share our presentation, that would be great. So my name is Laura Flaherty. I'm a project manager in planning services. I have the great pleasure of being responsible for the city's new zoning bylaw project, and I'm excited to be able to finally bring this project into fruition. Next slide, please, Blair. Before we get into it, here's a very quick overview of the anticipated agenda for this evening. So I'll be providing some background information about the new zoning bylaw project as a whole for members of the public who are not familiar with the project and the overall timeline associated with it. Paige Agnew, the Commissioner of Community Services, and Brent Todderan, a consultant at Todderan Urban Works and co-author of the parking discussion paper, will then join me in a formal presentation about the parking discussion paper. We'll then break to take questions and comments from members of committee and then members of the public. Following the completion of that first discussion paper, we'll then move on to the second discussion paper about tiny houses, shipping containers, and additional residential units. I will provide an overview of this paper in a formal presentation, then we'll move on to the same question and comment period. Next slide, please. So the new zoning bylaw has been talked about in Kingston for many, many years. Phase one of the project began back in 2011, and it established a strategic direction for a new zoning bylaw and created a direction for an RFP for a future consultant. The strategic direction was largely focused on a consolidation of the existing zoning bylaws. Phase two of the project was led by an outside consultant team, and it resulted in the creation of the first draft of the new zoning bylaw. The first draft was released in October of 2016, and extensive public consultation happened at that time. Following the release of the first draft, the project was put on hold to dedicate staff resources to other policy projects that needed to be completed in advance of the second draft, such as the official plan update, the Central Kingston Growth Strategy Study, and the addendum to the Williamsville Main Street Study. Next slide, please. So in Kingston, we currently have 5 main zoning bylaws that apply across the municipality. These bylaws are legacies of the former townships and predate amalgamation. 3 of the existing zoning bylaws were adopted in the 1970s, and 2 of the existing zoning bylaws were adopted in the 1990s. The patchwork of zoning that applies across the city is inconsistent, and it has different rules that apply to different areas. The existing zoning bylaws also predate our current official plan, which was enacted in 2010. This means that many of the existing zoning bylaw provisions that are in effect do not reflect the current official plan policies, and at present there's a disconnect between the vision for future growth of the city and the provisions of the existing zoning. Next slide, please. So when we talk about a new zoning bylaw for the city of Kingston, we have a vision to harmonize, simplify, and modernize the zoning framework across the municipality. Harmonizing the zoning provisions is more than just a consolidation exercise. It means we will carry forward some of the existing zoning bylaw regulations, but it also means that new and updated regulations will be created to ensure that the zoning bylaw aligns with the vision established by the official plan. Simplifying the zoning bylaw means that the language and maps will be modified to be as user-friendly as possible. Requirements will be clearer and more easily understood. Modernizing the zoning bylaw means that terms will be updated, uses will reflect current trends, and will be written in a way that allows for innovation for future trends and uses to thrive. Next slide, please. So we're now in the third and final phase of the new zoning bylaw project, which is being led entirely by staff and planning services. We are at the beginning of the public consultation in phase 3. The 2 public meetings tonight are the final 2 public meetings about the discussion paper topics. So following this public meeting tonight, we anticipate releasing the second draft of the new zoning bylaw to the public this summer. Public consultation on the second draft will follow the summer and fall, with a statutory public meeting at Planning Committee in early fall, followed by a special meeting of council. After all the feedback has been received on the second draft, staff will work to prepare a third and final draft, which is expected to be presented at a final statutory open house public meeting and for council's consideration in early 2022. The discussion papers presented to you tonight are the beginning of the public consultation on these topics, and final recommendations about these items will come at the same time as the final recommendations on the overall new zoning bylaw project. The feedback that we received tonight and over the course of the next 6 or so months will help to inform and guide our final recommendations for council's consideration. Next slide, please. So finally, before we jump over to the power of parking, there are many ways that members of the public can participate in the new zoning bylaw project. We have a project website as well as a Get Involved Kingston webpage dedicated specifically to the project. Staff are also maintaining a project email list where updates are sent when new documents are published or events are scheduled. Written comments can be sent via email or mail. Staff are also available to speak on the phone or meet virtually with interested members of the public. And finally, members of the public can attend future events and public meetings. With that, I'll hand it over to Paige Agnew, the Commissioner of Community Services, to kick off the parking discussion paper presentation. Slide, please.
Thanks, Laura. Sorry about that. My computer just timed out and went totally blank. I thought I was going to have to do the presentation from memory, and that would have been scary. Thanks, Laura. So we're really happy to be here tonight. This has been a lot of work, not just between, of course, Laura and Brent and I, who are going to be talking to you tonight about the power of parking in this parking paper, but also from a number of other colleagues within city departments. So it has really truly been a collaboration and something that we're proud to present to you. It is a lot of information, but we've done our best to try to break down the key points. And as Laura's indicated, we're always happy to have further conversations as a follow-up to this meeting to ensure that people are understanding the content as clearly as possible. Next slide, please. So we're really terming this a call to action. And really what we see this as is a strategic opportunity for Kingston to really achieve a paradigm shift with respect to how we look at the management of private parking supply. And we're really seeking to see a new understanding and a critical conversation about how powerful parking is in the way that you manage it relative to so many other public interest outcomes. We want to make sure through this paper and this conversation that the community is really connecting the dots with respect to parking strategy with a number of city goals. It's a discussion that's strategic, that's forward thinking. It's really positioning us as a leader, not only among smaller municipalities, but also nationally as well with respect to some of the key ideas that we've expressed in this paper. And most importantly, in the work and formulating the work that's before you tonight, we really wanted to be cognizant of a made in Kingston approach, recognizing that there are unique opportunities and challenges within every community and making sure that the strategy that we're presenting for discussion on strategic parking management is really something that fits Kingston as a city. Next slide, please. So we talk about this a lot in the paper and really framing what we see as the big parking problem. And significantly over time, I think as a city, what we've been seeing is a total underestimation of the complexity of costs and consequences of mismanaged parking with respect to a number of public interest goals. And these align very strongly with the stated priorities of City Council within this term. Certainly looking at climate change and environment, getting to our 2040 goal of carbon neutrality and the critical link that this can help us to achieve those goals as a city. It's critical link also with affordability and housing affordability in the city, which is something that we've been struggling with and working at very tactically over the last number of years. Looking at the interrelationship between parking and overall equity in the community, its interconnection with good urban design or consequently also bad urban design and how that affects people's sense of place and how the city is from a visual point of view. how it connects with public spaces and great opportunity to experience the life at the ground level, and also looking at its interconnection with the viability of housing creation in the city and what we've been able to measure and assess through different types of research, certainly from academic papers, but also in terms of looking at parking studies and talking with people on the ground of how it's impacting projects that we see going through Kingston. Next slide, please. So we wanted to look at creating definitions of success for this work from the onset. So with respect to this work overall, our definitions of success are the following. Number one, we wanted to ensure that this work is really representative of demonstrating leadership on climate action, not only just with respect to the zoning bylaw, but making the broader connections for the community with our stated aspirations of being Canada's most sustainable city, and certainly also a call to action in response to Council's declaration of climate leadership. We also wanted to ensure that the work would be a direct reflection of Kingston goals and values. Again, just reiterating some of our key priorities around housing affordability, helping to further all of the work that's been done so far by transit and transportation services with respect to active transportation and transit, and how we could really show the integration between how we're managing parking overall for different vehicles and really getting to that multimodal shift that we're looking for as a city. We're also looking at the interconnection with urban health, social equity, livability, and quality of life. So we really want a strategy on parking that is connected to all those things specifically and helps to advance those objectives. We want to make sure as well through the development of the new standards that we're ensuring the feasibility of appropriate infill development, because this is a critical link to the city's overall strategic goals with respect to growth management over the next 25 years. And fourth, and not least important, actually quite important, is that we want to make sure that the regulations that we're creating are easy to understand and easy to implement. And that ties back to some of the pieces Laura already spoke about with respect to modernizing, simplifying, and harmonizing our zoning bylaw moving forward. Next slide, please. I've already touched on the need and in terms of our terms of success of making sure that what we're coming forward with is really something that's a made in Kingston approach. Certainly there's always the opportunity to learn from other cities. And certainly as part of the work in the background educational work that was done primarily by Laura, she's looked at over 100 different Kingston planning applications and parking studies, as well as a host of academic research from across the country and internationally with respect to what's going on in the conversation around strategic parking management. Certainly, you know, we have been inspired by other cities, but we want to make sure that what we come forward with makes sense for Kingston in the moment that we're in right now, and most specifically in where we want to go over the next 25 years. We want to make sure that it's really reflective of the conditions and experiences in Kingston. We do have some unique challenges here. We have a very specific and unique landscape. We have a certain amount of heritage landscape that is so critical and precious to the city. And we really thought about that in the context of parking, and you'll see that presented later on in the paper as well. And again, we already are inspiring other small and medium-sized cities in the work that we've been doing, and through social media, we've certainly seen a lot of conversations with respect to this parking paper, not only within Canada, but we've also seen it internationally as well. So Kingston is on the map with respect to this conversation we're having, and people are really paying attention to the innovative work that's being presented here tonight. Next slide, please. We wanted to be clear up front too about what this proposal won't do. And we have had some questions of clarification as we've rolled out the paper, and really trying to understand what this paradigm shift will do and really what it's not meant to do. So the one thing in particular we want to highlight is that the current and future supply of accessible parking will not be reduced by any of the information that we're presenting or initial ideas tonight. That was a key focus for us, thinking about the multimodal aspect, the real inclusivity that we try to achieve as a city with respect to all citizens, also looking at our aging demographic and knowing that we have a number of people living in our community that have chosen to live here long-term, or maybe have relocated here for part of their retirement years, and how can we be really mindful about that in the creation of the new parking standards in the zoning bylaw. Any of the ideas that we're presenting through this paper will not force owners to get rid of existing parking spaces. And that's really important to understand. This is really about setting a framework that will be applied against net new development, So anything that's existing in the city is not under threat by way of these new ideas that we're introducing through the paper. We also wanted to say really specifically that reducing parking minimums won't necessarily reduce the amount of parking built. And we'll get into this a little bit further. Certainly, it's an important piece to look at as a city as you're trying to reduce overall parking. But there are some really other key strategic things to understand about human behavior, how developments come together. So this doesn't necessarily guarantee that less parking is going to be built, and we'll talk about that and explore that a little bit further in the presentation. And really what this doesn't do as well is it leaves minimum parking decisions to builders, although residential maximums are also being considered to prevent oversupply or excessive supply. So this is one of the key things that we're exploring is reducing parking minimums, but also looking at exploring parking maximums to help with that very problem that I've just mentioned. And we'll explore that a little bit further in the presentation. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to really focus on is that, again, this is linked to the city's zoning bylaw. And this is one element of the zoning bylaw, which is why we're having a really focused conversation on it tonight. And it applies to privately owned parking. So some of the questions we've had so far have really been, is this relying upon, or is it thinking about shifting what we're doing with respect to the public parking supply? That is not the focus of this work. This is really about how we regulate private parking supply on a go-forward basis. So on-street parking, so where people are parking on the street, whether it's on arterial roads, whether it's in neighborhoods, whether it's in city-owned parking garages, none of that consideration, that is not within the scope of this. This is about privately owned property because those are elements that we're not regulating through the zoning bylaw. So we wanted to make that really clear distinction, and we're happy to answer further questions on that. And the other part about this too that has to be really importantly understood is that any of the ideas that we're presenting here tonight are not intended to shift the burden from private properties to municipal supply. So we wanted to be really clear up front that where we're reducing parking minimums, it's not the idea that the city then provides that additional parking elsewhere within like the municipal realm. This is really about private parking and making sure that it's being built within the private market and it's not shifting to the municipal supply or onto the taxpayer specifically. Next slide, please. So in terms of the true cost of parking, and I believe right now we're going to transition over to Brent. Oh, there you are. You're on camera. Thanks, Brent.
Hi.
To you.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of committee, and hello, everyone listening. I'm going to cover a number of slides that facilitate this point of connecting the dots between parking, which is usually considered a very technical and frankly rather boring conversation in most contexts, to these larger public aspirations and certainly the specific aspirations, goals, and values of City Council and the City of Kingston. And it's probably important to start with what we've called the true cost of parking. We tend to think about the cost of parking in the context of how much money you may put into your meter or through new technology to pay for parking when you're on Main Street. But the cost of parking, the cost of providing parking, building parking, maintaining parking is shockingly expensive in ways that are obvious and many ways that are not. And we're talking about financially expensive, but many of the costs are also about much more than money, as we'll get into in various parts of this conversation. It's critically important to understand that we all pay the costs, the price of parking, and particularly too much parking. So this is not a conversation about saving the developers money. This is about actually saving all of us in terms of the costs and consequences of excessive parking. It is true that developers front end the initial costs of design, approval, and construction of parking, but really that's just the start of the paying for parking. Plus, developers don't really end up paying for that parking because they always pass those costs along to someone. So when we're talking about developer interest in terms of parking, it's really important to remember that developers don't make a profit on parking, but they also never take a loss on parking either. It's always passed along to someone else, and we all end up paying. And that means higher prices and less value for everyone else. Everyone ends up paying directly or indirectly for the amount of parking we're providing. Homeowners and renters through higher purchase prices and rental rates, stores and services through higher rents, consumers through higher price of goods and services, employers through higher office rents, employees through lower wages, and often even through having to pay for their own parking at work, property owners through lower land value or property value, taxpayers through higher taxes or fewer services, or both, which is often the case. Everyone, including future generations who aren't even with us yet, in some way pay for the mistake of over-providing for parking through many of the extended costs and consequences of climate change, air pollution, public health costs, higher infrastructure costs, and all the opportunity costs related to the many important things that we're frequently told we can't afford, that we don't have discretionary money for after we have financially accommodated cars and their storage space first. So the true costs of parking, as we've really talked about very candidly in this report, are extensive and everybody pays. Next slide, please. When we think about these costs, it's important to understand that the costs of parking are not borne equitably. Lower income households pay a disproportionate percentage of their household costs on parking, whether they actually use the parking or not. Often the cost is hidden. We don't necessarily know how much we're paying for it. It's just included in our cost of housing, but our cost of housing is much greater because of it. And it's also important to remember that constructing parking is expensive everywhere, but it's particularly expensive here in Kingston. As Ms. Agnew noted, because of your regional bedrock geology, it's even more expensive in Kitchener, or Kingston, I'm very sorry, Kingston, than it is everywhere else. So when you compare a city like Kitchener and Kingston, for example, parking is very expensive in both cities, but it's even more expensive to construct underground in Kingston than it is for a city like Kitchener. So parking can be easily translated into 12.5% of the housing costs of a home for one space of parking, up to 25 or more percent of the overall household costs for two spaces. So if you can reduce the number of spaces, not necessarily to zero, even if you just reduce it from 3 spaces to 2 or 2 spaces to 1, it has a significant effect on the affordability of your housing costs, and disproportionately benefits those who are lower income if you can reduce those parking costs. Next slide, please. When it comes to thinking about the connection to the climate emergency and Kingston's bold move to be the first Ontario municipality to declare the climate emergency, we know that the transportation sector represents 30% of Kingston's greenhouse gas emissions, which is actually higher than the Canadian average. So transportation is taking up a greater component of your climate footprint, your carbon footprint in your city than even the rest of the cities in Canada. And we know that pollution is more than just what comes out of the tailpipe. Electric energy emissions are in addition to that, and of course, brake and tire pollution particles, which are a significant part of our pollution picture in our Canadian cities, exist whether you have anything coming out of the tailpipe that's particularly bad or not. And this is important to recognize in the context of electric vehicles. These forms of pollution, these types of pollution exist whether the source of the energy is electrical or fossil fuel based. Next slide, please. Similarly, no matter what kind of vehicle you have, there are significant emissions that come from accommodating the vehicle storage, the parking itself. The greenhouse gas emissions from construction materials, concrete, asphalt, and steel are staggering. For example, the global cement production a generation of greenhouse gas emissions is 5% of the global CO2 emissions. So just the creation of cement, it makes up 5% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. And global steel production is actually pretty similar in terms of its carbon footprint, and asphalt asphalt as well. So it's not just the car itself, no matter what comes out of the tailpipe, it's the manufacturing of the car, it's the manufacturing of the parking, it's the manufacturing of all the roads that accommodate the additional cars that are actually supported, encouraged, and facilitated by that additional or excessive parking. So the climate consequences of doing parking wrong are staggering and go well beyond what comes out of the tailpipe. So whether you're an electric vehicle or a fossil fuel-based vehicle, you are generating a huge carbon footprint in the amount of space that's being taken up to move your car and store it. Next slide, please. we thought a lot about how to connect the dots between our parking strategy and the city's very ambitious and laudable active transport and public transit goals. And it's true that parking needs to be much more strongly aligned with those broader active transport and transit goals. And the truth is, not only are they not currently aligned, often the parking approach is actively representing a barrier in the achievement or improvement of active transport and public transit goals. And so that not only misses your chance to leverage the city's investments and successes in active transport and transit, but it actually can take you in the wrong direction. Next slide, please. And when it comes to the public realm, which is about the quality of life of our public life, so obviously important during this pandemic, the quality of space that we have when we go outside of our homes, the parking is often laid out first and is often designed before even the buildings or other parts of a site or development is built. And it's absolutely true, and particularly with surface parking, that the amount of parking you have just uses up a lot of the space and limits many other opportunities. The way I often say it is, the less space we take up by parking, the better design we get for everything else. But it is very true in Kingston, as it is in many other cities, that currently right now, the parking is actually dictating a fair amount of the design of your sites and of your public realm, and thus the quality of your public life. Next slide, please. It's not necessarily intuitive for everyone to think that excessive parking actually induces car ownership, but research has actually shown that. The more parking you have, the more likely you are to own more vehicles. And the more vehicles you own, the more likely you are to drive more. It's also even being connected with the demonstrated growth in the size of vehicles over the last decade or so. So we're owning more cars and vehicles, we're driving them more, and they're getting bigger. Even as the technology increases in the context of EVs, the actual increase in number of vehicles, driving distances, and size of vehicle is actually taking us in the wrong direction relative to our greenhouse gas emissions. So for those reasons, and many others that we have talked about in our parking report, the first goal, always from a public interest perspective, has to be fewer cars and less driving, because that's what we actually need to achieve Kingston's climate aspirations. The second goal, which is important, but it always has to be second to the goal of fewer cars and less vehicles, is to ensure that those vehicles we have still in the city and are expected to have for still quite some time are lower emission vehicles. Next slide, please. We've, of course, given a lot of thought to how this particular parking strategy, these kinds of ideas, relate to the moment that we are in, not just the city that we're in, but the moment that we're in, coming out of the pandemic into what is expected to be a very challenging economic recovery. And that has issues and implications that are significant. There are many questions that we have about what transportation will look like, and what other aspects of city building will look like once we get out of the period of time when we're all being vaccinated and through the economic recovery that we're expecting to have. So there's a lot of unknowns right now, but we do know this, that the challenges that we actually had before this pandemic that have been discussed in this report, such as climate change, social equity, infrastructure costs, public health, etc., those challenges existed before, they will exist after, and they actually could get worse based on the decisions we make in response to this pandemic. So it's very important that we have this lens of looking at this strategy through the economic recovery from COVID, but we also have to recognize that in our response to the COVID pandemic, we don't make those pre-existing conditions and pre-existing challenges such as climate change worse as a result of our inactions. The long-term impacts of COVID-19 are still unknown. We're expecting that we're going to keep having this conversation about parking in the context of modes of transportation in the coming years, but we're confident that we've made the right decisions in the right moment and context relative to the things that we don't know. And I'll give you just one example of that, Mr. Chair. In many of these studies in ambitious cities, there has been a parking maximum established for commercial uses, for shopping uses. Actually, it's one of the most common public policy tools because one of the places where we've seen the most excessive overbuilding of parking has been in commercial. And as a matter of fact, we've heard in many examples with our stakeholders of how particular locations in Kingston that are known for having just massive amounts of unused parking because the parking was overbuilt in front of the store. Because of the unknowns and the particular challenges that the retail and commercial sectors are facing coming out of this pandemic, we are not recommending at this time to consider parking maximums for that particular sector, because we want to make sure that that sector is positioned as positively as possible coming through the economic recovery. Next slide, please. We've looked carefully, as Ms. Agnew said, and been inspired by other cities that have that are ahead of us in this and that we have much to learn from. We've reviewed dozens of municipal parking studies and approaches from cities of all sizes. And so Laura is not only an expert at every parking study that's ever been written for your city, she's also probably an expert, as are many of us, on all the other studies that other cities across Ontario of all sizes and across Canada have done. And we've been meeting with leading cities and picking their brain, figuring out why they did what they did, what they've learned, what's worked and what hasn't worked, what they've avoided doing. And really, I think the goal has been to be inspired by those other cities, but our goal initially was to be also inspiring, particularly to smaller and mid-sized cities across Ontario. And we are already finding that that goal is succeeding, as we're seeing many cities across the country contact us to try to get more information about what is being discussed and considered here in Kingston. So I'll move on to the next slide. And as I do that, I'll also pass it over to Laura, who will continue.
So the very first thing I'm going to say is that we're not presenting recommendations and that our minds are not made up. So we've been very deliberate in our language, identifying initially preferred options and also including some other options that can be considered. What we really want is to have an unprecedented, connected and candid conversation with everyone having a broader understanding of the implications, costs, and consequences of parking. The intent of the paper is to start a bold new public conversation. And as I stated earlier, the final recommendations will come when the recommendations are made on the overall new zoning bylaw project. Next slide, please. So not all areas of the city are equal when it comes to transportation choices other than driving. And the first initially preferred option in the paper includes 5 potential parking areas that range from downtown to inner city to suburban and rural forms of development, with different approaches for each context. Some areas of the city are well served by a more compact built form with a mix of uses in a highly walkable environment, like the downtown area, for example. Some areas have excellent access to frequent transit service, and some areas are traditionally more car-oriented in their form and fabric. We are most able to reconsider traditional approaches to parking in places where other good transportation choices exist. The 5 potential parking areas identified in the paper have the preferred ratios for each of those areas and have been carefully crafted to reflect the different transportation context within those locations. Next slide, please. So what are parking minimums? Essentially, they're numbers included in a zoning bylaw that tell every property owner how many parking spaces they need to have on their properties, depending on the type of building and the use. One of the most common problems associated with city mandated parking minimums is that they are applied generally, and they often result in an oversupply of parking that may be underutilized most of the time. When we talk about parking minimums for residential uses specifically, we typically connect them to the number of residential units that are on a property. So the initially preferred option, which uses the location-based approach that I spoke about in the previous slide, it includes some areas that would be subject to modest reductions based on what the current requirements are, such as the suburban and rural areas of the city, and other reductions that are more transformative and significant, such as the downtown and areas that are located on express transit routes. Generally speaking, the option that we've identified as the preferred option in the discussion paper represents a reduction as low as 20% and as high as 60%, when compared with the existing parking requirements in the city. Next slide, please. So in recommending parking minimums, there are two specific scenarios that we have treated differently. The preferred option includes the complete removal of parking minimums for heritage properties and for affordable housing developments, which is the most significant change in the parking minimums identified in the paper. It reflects our strong interest in making things easier and more flexible in these areas. It would allow for heritage conservation and reuse to be put first, and allow for parking to be provided in a way that makes sense depending on the specific constraints of the property and depending on the nature of the specific use. It would also allow for affordable housing providers to decide how many spaces to provide relative to the nature of the planned housing, and would ensure that the money that they spend on parking is for parking that's actually required by future tenants. Next slide, please. When it comes to commercial parking, our favored option is to strategically lower commercial parking minimums so that one common ratio applies across the board. This approach would remove a lot of the red tape currently experienced when changing from one commercial tenancy to another. So for example, when we look at how restaurants have been historically regulated in the zoning bylaw, they're required to provide more parking spaces than retail stores. So it causes a really big administrative issue when you're changing from one commercial tenant to a restaurant in an existing commercial plaza or a commercial building. So the favored approach would eliminate these issues and would allow for existing commercial buildings to easily change between commercial tenants without having to pave more of their properties or spend time and money asking for the city to reduce their parking requirement on a site-specific basis. So overall, the commercial minimums favored by the paper would position Kingston as one of the most progressive municipalities in Ontario. Next slide, please. One of the most important things to know, as Paige had indicated earlier, is that the removal or reduction of the minimum parking requirements doesn't actually necessarily result in less parking. So with parking minimums alone, property owners have the ability to provide as much parking as they want as long as it's over the minimum. This is where parking maximums come in. So parking maximums are specific numbers in a zoning bylaw that establish the maximum number of parking spaces a property can provide depending on the use. So they are the strongest way to prevent the excessive oversupply of parking and one of the most important innovations considered by the paper. So as we indicated earlier, at this time, we're only considering parking maximums for the multi-unit residential developments, and we've not identified maximums for commercial or other non-residential uses. So in establishing the preferred maximums for the multi-unit residential, we've looked back at experiences in Kingston and we've asked ourselves at what point staff have been concerned with an oversupply of parking, especially since council has declared their climate emergency. So these experiences have informed the parking maximums that we've identified in the discussion paper, which are 1 space per unit in the downtown and Williamsville areas and 1.5 spaces per unit in the rest of the city. Next slide, please. So while the overall intent of the paper is to reduce the number of parking spaces, it also seeks to ensure that there's no reduction in the supply of accessible parking spaces. So the paper has identified new ways to ensure that the supply of accessible spaces is maintained and in some instances even exceeds the current supply requirements. The paper also suggests some strategic adjustments to the design requirements of accessible spaces, which better align with the provincial AODA standards while addressing some of the observed challenges of the current requirements. I'd also like to take a very quick opportunity to identify an error that was on page 93 of the discussion paper, where the intent of the AODA was quoted from an older source and had included the language "to the extent possible." So just clarifying that the purpose of the AODA is to develop, implement, and enforce accessibility standards in order to achieve accessibility for Ontarians with disabilities by January 1st of 2025, with no qualifier about "to the extent possible." Next slide, please. So based on what we have said so far, you might be asking why we just don't get rid of minimums altogether. And it's an option that we have considered extensively in writing the paper. And it's an option that's also specifically identified as another option in the paper. So Ultimately, the initially favored option that we've identified is to continue to require the lowered parking minimums for various uses and create a framework in the zoning bylaw that allows for incentives to be used to help to achieve other public interests that support less parking. So incentives included in the paper would allow for the parking minimum to be further reduced if certain facilities are provided, such as car share parking spaces, enhanced bike parking facilities, and electric vehicle supply equipment. Next slide, please. We've also identified new enhanced bike parking opportunities that can either be required by the zoning bylaw or included as an incentive in the zoning bylaw, provided in exchange for that lowered parking minimum. So starting with the potential requirements, we've identified minimum required bike parking ratios for residential, commercial, industrial, and recreational uses. The minimums are further broken down into short-term versus long-term. So the intent of the short-term spaces are to provide spaces that can be easily accessed by visitors to a property, whereas the long-term spaces are intended to be provided for owners or residents or employees who have access to more secure facilities on the property itself, such as shared bike parking rooms with bike racks. Next slide, please. We've also identified new requirements to provide end-of-trip facilities, which would require shower, change rooms, and clothes lockers for non-residential uses. So this innovation is intended to provide facilities for cyclists who ride their bike to their place of work. Bike theft is also a major issue that affects cyclists and would-be cyclists in Kingston. So even the long-term bike parking spaces, which are typically provided in some type of shared bike parking room that multiple people can access, they provide potential bike theft opportunities. And there are certainly cyclists who are reluctant to use even those secure bike parking rooms. So we've identified a requirement to provide enhanced bike security measures for a certain percentage of the bike spaces, which would result in individual bike lockers being provided for extra security for people who are interested. Finally, we've also seen a new trend in larger bikes, including accessible bikes and cargo bikes, bike trailers. So our initially preferred option includes a small percentage of larger bike parking spaces to recognize and support this trend. Next slide, please. So beyond the requirements, we're moving into the incentives now. So the initially favored option includes a number of potential incentives. These incentives would allow for further reduction of the minimum parking requirements in exchange for additional standard or larger bike spaces, additional bike lockers, e-bike spaces, weather protection for short-term bike spaces, and bike maintenance areas. Next slide, please. As far as design requirements are concerned, the paper outlines the need to meet certain sizes for bike spaces with appropriate bike racks that allow for bikes to be secured with a lock. So the initially favored option has also built in some flexibility, recognizing that different formats of bike racks, such as horizontal, vertical, or stacked bike spaces, as you can see in this photo, the different formats allow for more efficient use of the long-term bike storage rooms while continuing to maintain the functionality and ease of use of the rack itself. Next slide, please. So another incentive that we've explored in this paper is parking spaces that are dedicated to car share vehicles. So car sharing is essentially a car rental service where members can easily book cars for shorter or longer intervals of time. Car share vehicles are typically parked in locations that are easily accessed by members of the company. It's been found to be really key in reducing not only vehicle use, but vehicle ownership as well. So the paper identifies an opportunity in the zoning bylaw to include incentives where the minimum parking requirement would be reduced by 5 parking spaces for every 1 car share parking space that's provided. And it would ultimately help to encourage the creation of a more robust car share market in Kingston and may require a larger strategic effort to really get that to take hold in the area. Next slide, please. So in some scenarios like the car share that I just discussed, we've identified a very specific incentive. When it comes to the EVSE or electric vehicle supply equipment, there are many complexities to consider, including whether we're allowed to require them under the existing provincial legislation. So when we talk about EVSE, there are 2 different elements to consider from the zoning bylaw perspective. The first is the actual installation of the charging station itself and all of the infrastructure necessary to support it. And the second is a construction approach that would allow for the easy installation of that supply equipment in the future. So that second approach is typically called EV ready or EV capable, whether the electric loads are calculated for the EV ready or whether they aren't calculated for the EV capable. So we've not provided a specific favored option for EVSE, and it's one of the main parts where the conversation is ongoing, whether it should be an incentive or a requirement in the zoning bylaw or potentially both. So we're continuing to do our legal due diligence and consultation with stakeholders who have direct experience to ensure that the recommended approach meets all of the objectives and is aligned with the ongoing development of the Green Standard CIP that our colleagues in climate leadership are currently undertaking. So next slide, please. So there are a number of equally important topics in the paper that haven't been highlighted, just in the interest of time, recognizing that we have already taken longer than typical with a staff presentation. So the paper also includes some improved approaches to dimensions for both parking and loading spaces. It introduces potential new shared parking provisions that will allow for different uses on the same property to share their minimum parking space requirements. We're happy to answer any questions or provide additional details about these specific topics. Next slide, please. And before we conclude the presentation, we've had an opportunity to consult with some interested members of the public and stakeholders in this conversation since the release of this paper on June 1st. And there are 6 pieces of formal correspondence on tonight's addendum. So far, we've received a number of compliments on the approach overall, one that connects the dots with clear language and messaging. Appreciation has been shown for the connections to cycling, transit, car share, and EVs with user-friendly language in the paper. There's been generally a lot of support embracing new ideas with excitement about a paradigm shift and the clear recognition that this is the direction that we need to move as a city. There have been a number of concerns identified, some identifying that this is for a big city and it's not for Kingston, and clarification and comments have been provided about the accessible parking approach and the intent of the AODA. Some residents have identified concerns that the suburbs are not ready to get rid of their cars and shouldn't be treated the same as urban areas of the city. Concerns have been raised about the negative impacts to on-street parking and commuter parking in the inner city, and developers have generally been supportive with some concerns about the new maximums. Next slide, please. With that, I will turn it over to you, Mr. Chair, for questions and comments from members of Planning Committee. Thank you. Oh, you're on mute, Councillor Neal, sorry.
So I am. We'll follow the usual process, which is allowing committee members to ask questions and then opening it up to the public. Members of the public will be given 5 minutes after identifying themselves with name and address. And after 5 or 6 of those periods from the public, we'll give staff an opportunity to answer that whole series of questions. So we'll now open it up to members of the committee. If anybody has any questions, and I'm sure you do. Yes, Councillor Hill.
So I thank you for the presentation. By the way, let me start with that. This is been a ton of work, and we're grateful for what you're bringing forward, because it really does, I think, create a new vision for us, and I'm afraid of the vision. And I think probably there's a fair number of us in the suburbs who are very, very concerned that we kind of live in a city designed for winter, and maybe designed around the car. I mean, even though Kingston's an old city, certainly lots of parts of it are designed around the car. And I guess that would be the obviously hand in hand with this goes, some substantial improvements in terms of public transportation, which we've already undertaken in many respects. But how do you speak to that? Like there are 2 different cities here. Like we're seeing some real concentration happening in the downtown core, but my district, for example, is and always will be a suburb, and if people here feel that they can't have access to a car, or that it's being actively discouraged, I think they're going to be afraid of that sort of what that's going to look like down the road. Or are they being driven to kind of move away from the suburbs and into, you know, a more concentrated living downtown, which they may not want. So, you know, how do I sort of how do you kind of reconcile, I guess, what I think is a city that really was designed for the car and for winter, against what you're suggesting, you know, might be the future here.
And I see Commissioner Agnew has her hand up. So the floor is yours, Paige.
Thank you, Councillor Neal. I'll provide a couple of introductory comments. I know we're also joined by our Director of Transportation, Ian Semple, and certainly Laura and Brent may have comments. To your point, Councillor Harrell, I think I'll take the group and the members of the public that are on the call back to some of our slides about the Made in Kingston solution. And a lot of that was recognizing, you know, where we are at this moment in time as a city with respect to walkability, access to transit, connectivity between neighborhoods and to arterial roads, and that's developed to varying degrees within the city. Certainly where we've looked at more aggressive reductions in the parking minimums. Those are really in areas that are most highly serviced from a transit, walkability, commercial amenity perspective, where having a life that isn't as car dependent is much more readily available. So we've really tried to look at that in designing ideas for discussion with the public that are mindful of where we are, but are also tying us to where we want to go. And the other point that I would bring us back to is that this is with respect to net new development going forward. So there's nothing in these zoning bylaw changes that we're discussing and ideas that we're discussing that are retroactive. So there's nothing that would go back and say any type of existing situation with cars, you can't have that parking, you have to remove that, you have to have less vehicles. That's not the intention of this work at all. So I think it's really about what we see in the past in terms of our approach has been that the city has been regulating an excessive amount of building of parking in multiple areas through our zoning bylaw. So right now, our ratio in most areas is 1 space per 1 unit. And really what this does is it allows a reduction to build less than that if you want to. And then with the idea of a maximum, which we're also putting out there, is we look very carefully at the parking studies that have been done and looking at developments that have been built and suggesting initial places for a maximum that would not be drastically lower and consistent with what's already being built now, given the built environment the way that it is. So I think there's been a lot of consideration, and what we've said too is that, you know, this is a moment in time for us as a city. And as pieces of the active transportation plan at the neighborhood level are built out to a greater degree, as we see transit ridership hopefully increase again post-pandemic, the city always has the opportunity to review and revise some of these strategies going forward. It doesn't mean that we have to do everything right now, but we need to have a position that first and foremost gets us out of the position of requiring people to build excessive amounts of parking because our zoning bylaw regulations, a lot of them are very old, some of them 30 and 40 years, and really trying to bring something up to more of a modern day standard. I see that Brent has some comments. I don't know if Mr. Semple will maybe make some more comments with respect to some of those active transportation pieces, because certainly we've been working in lockstep strongly with his team on this as well.
Yes, Mr. Totter, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, I'd just add to Ms. Agnew's excellent answer. There's sort of two realities that I think we really tried to wrap our mind around. One is the complete understanding that we are dealing with two, I don't know if I'd put it quite the way the council did, two different cities, but there's certainly two significant contexts, and probably more than two, because we have not only suburban but rural contexts, and we have different levels of urban that currently existing in the city of Kingston. So probably the most important slide to answer your question is the slide that Laura showed about not one size fits all, and recognizing what is ambitious, but also realistic. And by realistic, I say realistic in the context of a climate emergency, because if you're too realistic, then you're not addressing the climate emergency. So how to figure out what's both ambitious, but also feasible in the context of where the city is, but where the city is also wanting to go. And that that was the subject of probably hours of conversations that we had in the establishment of the specific numbers, both the vision, but also the specific numbers. So we didn't want to bore you with the numbers by getting deeply into how the numbers change based on different contexts of the city. But I think it's fair to say and accurate to say that the approach geographically in the city reflects the differences in the parts of the city. It always seeks to be ambitious in the context that we're talking about. So what's an ambitious approach to parking in the suburbs? What's an ambitious approach to parking in the rural areas? And that's going to be very different than an ambitious approach in the downtown or in Williamsville, for example. But certainly we took leadership from you, from council, to be ambitious, because by definition, this is us sort of telling the truth about the implications of the declaration of climate emergency and the incredibly powerful tool of parking, and whether or not you respect that declaration. So it's not an easy thing to do. It recognizes the city you are, but it also takes your lead in saying that if you want to become the most sustainable city in Canada, if you want to take the climate emergency seriously, you do have to change the city that you are. But what is a reasonable and realistic amount of change in the context of where you are and how things might go? That is the moment that we're in. This is not revolutionary, but it is evolutionary in the context towards achieving your own goals. That's how I would put it.
Thank you. Any further questions from members of the committee? Yes, Vice Chair Kiley.
Thank you, Councillor Neal, through you, and thanks to Ms. Flaherty and everyone else who put so much time into doing this and for encouraging us along. I echo Councillor Hill's praise, and I'm very grateful for this. And thanks also to staff for taking the extra time to engage with councillors and members of the public in lead up to this meeting, and this meeting be part of that feedback that you're receiving. I'm hoping that maybe, Ms. Flaherty, you could explain a bit further, and I know you started to, the difference between minimums and maximums, just for the benefit of committee, to be frank, but also of people paying attention. Does maximum mean, for example, that a developer couldn't go over X number of parking spots based on whatever the building is? Could you just play it out a bit more for us?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's a great question. So that's exactly right. So essentially a minimum is you have to provide at least this many spaces, and a maximum is you can't provide more than this many spaces. So it's essentially establishing a range, saying you have to provide at least this many, but no more than this many. So if you just have one or the other, a minimum would really say you have to provide at least this many, but the sky's the limit. You can provide as many as you want above that. And the opposite would be you could provide 0 up to whatever this point would be for a maximum. So it's really just establishing that range.
Yeah, you've kind of anticipated my supplemental, which was, do they hold each other in tension? So do we have minimum and maximum, or just maximums?
It's certainly right now the preferred option in the paper establishes both for the multi-unit residential, but just establishes the minimum for the remainder of the uses. So just reiterating to Councillor Hill's question earlier about suburban residents, so the lower density residential, we aren't anticipating these changes to really have any impact on the parking that would be provided, even in future suburban forms of development as far as a minimum goes, because the minimum is very similar to what's currently being provided, and there's no maximum being proposed. So you can continue to provide as many spaces in those contexts as you'd like.
Yeah, I think that's important. And also to your point during the presentation that there would be a bit of a dynamic that happens with respect to commercial space. So for example, myself also being a West End councillor, I've heard many times that folks are concerned about maybe driving downtown and not having a spot to park, but that's not really what we're talking about here if we're talking about maximums, because it is only the multi-residential, correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, exactly. So right now, we don't have any required parking downtown on private properties for the commercial uses as it stands. So many residents use this on-street municipal supply of parking when they're driving downtown. What we're actually talking about is the intensification of potentially multi-unit residential downtown being more feasible and not having to provide spaces in such a well-connected, walkable, mixed-use area that's serviced by the highest frequency transit and active transportation routes. So it's really about bringing residents downtown and having them have a lower parking rate because they're located downtown.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, I find that very exciting, and I would be prone to support this, but I know there's more to go in making final recommendations, which leads me to my next set of questions around timing on this. So you gave a kind of high level overview about the steps, but the thing I want to ask about is particular to the working paper, which talked about, for example, the city of Edmonton, or looked at other Canadian jurisdictions that have made some of these changes. And it's even mentioned in that paper that they did it over a number of years. I think Edmonton did some of these things over 10 years. If/when Kingston's ready to act on this, what type of time frame would these different initiatives roll out over? Do you have an idea of that?
Certainly, it's a great question through you, Mr. Chair. So obviously what we're proposing right now, or what we've identified as initially preferred options, not proposed recommendations at this point, is really what we think is appropriate given the current context in Kingston. And certainly if we were in a different scenario with transit service that might be a higher frequency, or a bus rapid transit, or more people who are interested in getting rid of their vehicles for various reasons, we would be suggesting that a preferred option could be more progressive than what we've proposed, maybe eliminating minimums altogether and establishing very aggressive maximums on commercial and multi-unit and a whole bunch of other forms of development. So I certainly think that in the future, if we found ourselves in a position that this is really the status quo and it isn't something that's progressive, and we think that we're ready to move somewhere, it's certainly within the realm of possibility to have a greater conversation at that point in time and to suggest amendments to the new zoning bylaw to reflect that.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. And I saw Commissioner Agnew had her hand up. Was your point covered, or did you want to chime in?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just quickly too, in terms of, Councillor Hill, and I'm a West End dweller as well, and thinking about, what the future looks like relative to moving around the city, maybe differently than it has been, with different areas of the city having access to different levels of active transportation networks and transit. Some of the key pieces that we are really thinking about and looking at as one of our initial preferred options is looking at the parking minimums being reduced versus getting rid of them altogether, is really that notion of how we could potentially utilize incentives by saying, we're going to lower the parking minimum, but if you want to go lower, here's some opportunities. And that's where EBs come in. Again, looking at, ensuring as a city that we're planning for what, could be the proliferation of a greater degree of electric vehicles coming into the market and people having the choices of that relative to where they live, the charging infrastructure. But the other part to it too, one of our key incentive considerations was trying to utilize, some of these approaches for net new parking to help incent car sharing. So again, it could be that, through the smart strategic way that we manage parking going further, or going beyond here into the future, is that it could create a market for car sharing, even with in suburban areas that people may always choose to have cars. So they may take transit, they may move differently in terms of electric scooters or bikes or things that are coming onto the market. But what it could do through smart strategic way of managing this is create a car share market where maybe a family would choose to have one car over two, because there would be a vehicle that's closely located in their neighborhood that they could use for convenient trips. So it's really trying to provide Kingstonians with greater options as well relative to car ownership that aligns with our climate change goals, and specifically looking at reducing that carbon footprint, whether it's through greater electrification that's available, but we know that's not going to get us all the way there. Really what we need to do over time to meet that carbon neutrality is have less cars overall on the road. And we're not really well positioned right now as a city to create a lot of opportunities, especially in the areas that, through the way the city has been designed and having three separate cities prior to amalgamation come together as one. They weren't designed that way, so we've been working really hard to interconnect them. But recognizing what you're saying, Councillor Hill, we're not there yet. So it's really about how can we smartly manage parking supply requirements going forward to help further the agenda of council with respect to carbon reduction, but also providing people with more choice that helps them to make those shifts, because the technology, the infrastructure, and the opportunity is there that currently we don't have in the city.
Thank you. Would you kindly take the chair and
I do, and I recognize you.
Thank you. A couple of points before I forget. Mr. Totterman mentioned the disturbing number of amounts of greenhouse gases produced in Kingston compared to other communities. And all my years on council, I've always represented a student, the university district, the student area. And the harsh realities make that a really unique area when we're talking about parking. First of all, and I was guilty of this, when a lot of post-secondary students come to a community, they often bring the oldest car in the family. And so we have older cars, less efficient cars, cars that often need a tune-up that don't get it. And so the result is we are producing more greenhouse gases. And just like they get to bring to Kingston the oldest couch in the house, and it very seldom goes home with them when they go home. So there are certain realities, and we have between 35 and 40,000 students between our three post-secondary institutions here in town. So that creates a problem. It creates a real, and the city planners have heard this all too often, it creates parking issues as well. We may say 1 or 1.5 parking spaces per unit, but if you have 14 bedrooms, as some of the developments do, and those 14 bedrooms have 14 adults living in them, often there are 8 or 10 cars. And that creates a real issue in the downtown core. And I think Councillor Hutchison, this affects his area as well. So that has created an issue, even though for a lot of those car owners, school may be walkable. They have a transit pass provided to them by their student associations, but nonetheless, there's a real parking issue in that area of the city. And I don't know, I'm hoping that somehow your recommendations can address that issue, but I'm not sure how to go about it.
Maybe we'll give staff a chance to reply to that.
Yes, please do.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So obviously, I think the conversations that we've had in the past have really connected the number of bedrooms to parking. So what we had in the past indirectly tried to do was control the number of bedrooms by saying, maybe we can look at a parking regulation that's connected to bedrooms. So what we've actually been doing recently, some of the work that was recently done and adopted by council, but has been appealed, so it's currently not in full force and effect, is actually a more direct bedroom limitation. So through that work, we're trying to directly regulate bedrooms through a provision that is more appropriate than parking. So having these conversations and the work that's being done on the CKGS, which will also be carried forward into the new zoning bylaw, we're anticipating that a lot of the existing development pressures that have historically caused a number of issues will be addressed more directly than through parking regulation. So the hope is that we don't need to use parking to control the intensity of the residential uses, and that we can ensure that parking that's provided actually reflects the scale and size of that use. And certainly the conversations that we're having, the multi-unit residential rates would not apply to those lower number of units and those ground related single detached, semi-detached duplexes. So certainly it doesn't prevent more parking spaces from being provided on those properties.
Councillor Neal, did you have further questioning?
Not at this time, no.
Okay, you can have the chair back.
Thank you. I believe, yes, Councillor Sanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, some questions to staff. So we're about to have a lot more people downtown. There's going to be high rises on Princess Street, on Queen Street, and on Ontario Street. So even though they'll be living downtown in those multi-residential units and you might not have a car, they could be requiring service workers, PSWs, it's written in the addeds tonight, the concern for parking for like for guest parking, right? For visitor parking, where are they supposed to park? And so if we're not going to have minimums, you know, how do we, can we at least stipulate like how many guest parking spots they're allowed, or what are we going to, how are we going to address that problem for service workers, PSWs, you know, visiting, making the house calls to those residents living in the multi-residential units downtown?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's a great question. So the discussion paper, right now, our existing zoning bylaws don't require visitor parking for multi-unit residential properties. So right now, it just requires the parking spaces to be provided for residents. As part of this work, we've recognized that developers or people who are property owners providing the parking spaces, they know who's going to be buying or renting or leasing their units, and they have the ability to ensure that the number of parking spaces is connected to those people who are going to live there. The one thing that they can't control or have less control over are the people who are going to be visiting. So as part of this work, we've actually included in our initially preferred option the creation of new residential visitor parking spaces for that exact reason. So it's certainly something that's not accounted for right now, but we think it's really important to, even if you're reducing the overall supply of residential spaces, to ensure that visitors to those residents aren't overflowing and impacting the on-street parking spaces, because it is not something that property owners can control.
That's good. Thanks for pointing that out. How would the number, how are you proposing that number be calculated? Is it some sort of formula based on the number of units in each high rise?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, and it's connected to the various parking areas. I believe in the downtown, there's a lot of stats in that report, so don't quote me on this, but I believe the number is 0.1 spaces per residential unit, so 10%, and then 0.15. So the 0.1 would be in downtown in Williamsville, and the 0.15 would be in the remainder of the city. I believe those are the numbers that we've used.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And then how are we going to, like, if we propose this and it goes through, how are we going to get feedback? So if I was moving into one of the multi-res and I needed more parking than what's provided and parking becomes a big issue, I could always complain to the building owner, right? But then how is the city going to hear all those complaints? As the owner might not want to reveal that to the city, because then it's like, oh my goodness, this isn't working. I'll just, oh, too bad, there's nowhere else for you to move to. So you're just going to have to put up with it. I'm just going to keep this quiet and not tell the city planners, because they might then take away this, like no minimum policy that they have. And that would be bad for me. So if I was the owner of the building. So how are we going to get this feedback?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think that's a really challenging question to answer. I'm not sure. We'll obviously receive complaints, and enforcement has to happen if they're parking on street in areas where they're not supposed to be parking. I think it's really important to recognize that people who are renting or purchasing units within a multi-unit residential, the number of parking spaces that they're provided should be the number of parking spaces that they're using. So it's not the city's responsibility to make up for that supply of parking spaces within those city-owned properties. And that's what we really want to ensure, is that the supply of these residential parking spaces is actually aligned with the number of spaces that people will be renting and using for those buildings.
Great, thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair, just my last question is, and I can't remember if when we did meet a couple, I don't know, was that 2 weeks ago, if I asked this question, but yeah, this is really progressive. I remember you saying, Ms. Flaherty, that the city of Saskatoon was contacting Kingston to try to find out, especially when this went on Global News or CBC News. And what city, so we talked about Edmonton, right, as being, kind of doing this. As far as Ontario goes, what is the closest city kind of looking or kind of implementing what we're doing, what we're proposing to do? I don't think there is another city that's quite like this so far. Is that what my memory recalls?
Through you, Mr. Chair, a couple of years ago, the city of Ottawa did a pretty significant overhaul to the downtown area requirements. So in their really urban area, they have no minimum requirements. They obviously continue to have parking requirements for a number of other uses across the city. So the parking discussion paper has included all of the City of Ottawa ratios. The City of Toronto is currently in the process. They were recently directed by their Planning and Housing Committee, I believe it's called, to review their parking minimums in their zoning bylaw with a stated goal of getting rid of the minimums. From a smaller sized and medium sized municipality perspective in Ontario, no one else has been doing this recently.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I did see Ian Semple's hand up, and I also see Brent Todderin wanted to weigh in. So whoever wants to jump on first, and then I'll recognize Councillor Hutchison, who hasn't spoken.
I'm happy to let Ian go first.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Just a follow-up to just a piece of information on Councillor Osanik's question from before. With respect to the way that private development, especially multi-residential development, impacts the public parking supply, especially the on-street supply. Part of that, and as Laura was talking, the way in which the development provides for that parking, but also the way in which the city regulates and manages its public parking. Part of the way that we do that in areas where there is high demand is and it's in our policies now, is that we limit the number of residential permits to a maximum of 3 for any address, for a multi-residential address. So if it's a single residential property or a single unit residential property, it's 1 permit that's available. And if it's multi-units, whether that is 5 units or 300 units, the number of permits or technically spaces that would be available within the vicinity in the public parking supply is capped at 3. And it's those types of regulations that allow us to regulate the and ensure that the public supply is being used in the way that that is for the greatest public good, and would limit the way in which a private development can rely on the public system.
Thank you. And Mr. Totter.
To the councillor's question about the closest cities or other cities that are doing this, I think Laura's answer is technically correct, that there are no official work programs that are well advanced, particularly of medium-sized cities. But in the context of the conversation that we've been having even over the last couple of weeks, I've been contacted by two mayors and a couple of chief planners that are really interested in the conversation. And what has struck me in that is that there are a number of small and mid-sized cities that have been very nervous about having this kind of conversation because of one of the very issues that has been brought up here in Kingston, which is the perception that this is a big city conversation. And so my observation is there are a number of cities waiting for someone else to be the first one to do it. And as soon as there is one to do it, suddenly there's a lot of people interested in piggybacking off that. And not only the first one to do it, but do it in such an overt and accessible public conversation way. So there's been particular interest. Interestingly, there's been interest in both smaller cities in the approach we've taken to the language and the conversation to make it more interesting and less boring. But we've also had interest from the bigger cities that have said, frankly, we wish we had done it that way because we probably would have had an easier job having a conversation that engaged more people. So I think the bigger cities are looking at what Kingston has done in terms of the quality and nature of the conversation and the language. But the smaller cities are looking at it in the context of, how do I put this candidly? Oh, thank God someone else is finally doing it first. And maybe that's going to give us the two mayors that contacted me, and I don't want to out them just in case they decide not to do it because I don't want to embarrass them. But I'm glad to let any councillor know who those mayors are, not in public. But that both mayors reached out and said it's already changed the conversation amongst the mayor and local councillors about whether this is quote unquote possible here. And I actually think that's one of the most inspiring and powerful things. We talk about climate change action within our municipality, but we often talk about the need because Kingston cannot solve the climate crisis on its own. By definition, we all have to be inspiring and educating other cities to follow along and do it with us. So that may very well be one of the most significant achievements out of this exercise, is not just what you do within your local municipality, but the other municipalities you inspire to do the same.
Thank you. We'll go to Councillor Hutchison now as a first rounder. I saw Councillor Hill's hand up with a follow-up, and then we'll go into allowing public questions or questions from the public. So the floor is yours, Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. There was a lot of really interesting things about this report, and especially around the true cost of parking. And I thank you for that. I'm not quite sure where to start here. I could see why we would want to set the parking minimums, but I don't see how that affects the basic affordability of housing. If a developer obviously creating more or less parking spaces costs less, but that doesn't translate into better rents. You just get fewer spaces and the same amount of rent as would be charged by the market that they think is allowable or that they can market. And as we know, we've got a lot of housing in Kingston, but it's not truly affordable. And I don't want to get into a debate about what's affordable and what's not, but I think we all know that there are calculations to be done. And so when it was stated by Littman that one parking space unit increases total development cost by about 12.5%. I wasn't quite sure 12.5% of what is, I guess it's the total development cost. I'm not sold on that. I need more information. It's interesting. It's clearly cuts the costs. It's quite a lot. So if you're doing this again, I'd like to see just how you got there, or how he got there.
Yes, Mr. Todderan, I think has
Sure.
his hand
Go
raised.
ahead.
Well, certainly we can have a conversation to your specifics about perhaps even having Mr. Lippman be part of the conversation moving forward, because I know his work at the Victoria Transport Institute is very well regarded across cities across Canada. And he's probably the best pound for pound researcher on this kind of thing on the continent. So and he loves to engage with municipal discussions like this. So I'll talk with Ms. Agnew about the possibility of having him perhaps provide clarity on some of his results. But can I say, in the context of the observations and work that I've done in various cities, I'll say this: you're not wrong, Councillor, that changing the minimums doesn't automatically guarantee more affordable units, because it also does not automatically guarantee less parking. As we've said several times, what it actually provides is flexibility for the marketplace, the builders particularly, to decide the optimal combination of marketability of the rental units and cost savings relative to construction of vehicles. And as I said to one councillor, I can't remember which, in the context of some of our conversations, how I suspect it will play out is you'll get situations where the technical math of the former minimum could lead to literally 1 or 2 parking spaces more than you could reasonably get on a level or tray of parking within a particular site. But in the current way of doing it, you literally are legally required to provide those parking spaces anyway, at a massive cost, opportunity cost per space, because you literally have to go another level underground. Or you have to go and ask the city to give you relief of those 2 parking spaces through an expensive and uncertain rezoning process. So the ability for them to say, I'm going to do 2 less parking because it actually fits into my physical site characteristics, or maybe do a few more because it happens to fit, and I've seen many developers do that. That flexibility often does lead to cost savings, both in terms of number of spaces and significant costs of having to go deeper, for example. And they will determine, in the context of the supply and demand of the marketplace, how that gets translated into market rents, et cetera. But there's no guarantee that it will lead to more affordability, but we do know that more affordability, there's a way that's often put, it doesn't guarantee affordability, but if you require too much parking, it guarantees unaffordability, because that cost automatically does get passed on to a renter or a buyer. But if it gets dropped, whether or not that saving gets passed on to a renter or a buyer actually depends on things like supply and demand and your vacancy rates and things like that. But over time, as things equalize, the trend line goes down in terms of cost, and it does get passed on. So that's what the various studies have shown. It's not a perfect relationship on a per space to per cost basis, but over the context of a system, that's what the analysis has shown us. But all of this, it just gives us one more chance to remind you that this won't automatically translate into less parking. It'll translate into flexibility and probably less parking in the context of site-by-site considerations for every development. And it will particularly provide more flexibility for the most constrained locations for parking supply, which are affordable housing and heritage projects, typically, which is why we're taking that specific approach of removing the parking minimums for those 2 types of uses. I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, but that's my best shot.
I think it does, but it relies too much on the nature of the market in Kingston, which hasn't been balanced in 15 years, right? Doesn't really allow for those mid to long-term considerations. So my main concern is affordability. And that we're not doing such a great job at. We got a ton of units coming online, and only theoretically does that work out, right? And as it was being said, in the long run, we're all dead. So, but I understand what you're saying. It just concerns me that if we don't have a minimum, you're right that it doesn't mean they won't build it anyway. I know that the homestead proposal on Queen Street, they were counting on a certain amount of parking because they thought that's what their clientele wanted. Right? And you can't get away from that kind of marketing. Whether it's accurate or not, like, there's a whole other debate, right? So
the interesting thing about that one, Councillor, is usually we've found that the developers that want that certain amount of parking for the purposes of marketability is what would be characterized as the high end of the market, which tends to be unaffordable for many reasons, not the least of which is parking, as I know you know. Where this most plays out, and I'm actually comforted by this because it works in the place we most want it to work. Where it most plays out is in the lower end of the market, all the way down to affordable units. And it's there where the flexibility will probably be taken most advantage of. And it's also the places where the affordability is most necessary, because there will always be people who are willing to pay more and able to pay more. But it's the sort of middle to lower end of the market range and down to affordability where we know it's disproportionately has effect, and it's also most likely to be taken advantage of, that flexibility. And it's also most likely for those cost savings to actually be passed on to the individual renter or purchaser. And that gives me some level of comfort, not over the entire system of housing, but particularly on the middle to low end of the market range.
Okay, that's an interesting argument, and I do get it. Mr. Chair, Ms. Agnew has her hand up.
Yes, Commissioner Agnew.
Thank you very much, Councillor Neal. One thing I would also add, Councillor Hutchison, again, going back to the whole notion of our team working on solutions that are reflective of like a made in Kingston solution and a recognition of where we are as a city is really that process that Laura undertook, reviewing 100 parking studies associated with site-specific applications. And outside of a few of the circumstances, and I would agree with Mr. Totteran's comments about parking, desire for parking relative to price threshold, oftentimes the majority of what we've seen on the multi-res side, which is really what we're talking about with respect to some of the options we've brought forward, whether it's reducing parking minimums, which is our preferred option at this point. We haven't put eliminating parking minimums altogether as our preferred option, is that we see almost every project coming in, at least in the time that I've been with the city over the last 6 or 7 years, we rarely see a multi-res project that is suggesting they want to build at a 1-to-1 ratio. A lot of the times we're seeing at minimum a reduction down to 0.5 is what's being requested. And I'm sure Planning Committee would be familiar seeing a lot of projects coming through requesting that 0.5. And that also corresponds with having to do an expensive parking study to drop it down to the 0.5, which is almost in some ways become a bit of a Kingston standard, especially for multi-res in the downtown. So part of our approach has been to recognize what we've seen and what we've seen being built, and those projects recognizing what's required from a user perspective or from a tenant perspective, and just making sure that we're not making people overbuild or go through a process of asking for a reduction that we see time and time again, because that suggests to us that our requirement is too high in the first place. So that's been sort of a path of looking at that information to see what's been happening, and then trying to certainly make the connection with some of the preferred options that are in the paper for discussion, as part of like really looking at that made in Kingston solution of where we are at this point in time.
Thank you.
I've got a couple more questions.
Okay. My only concern is that if the committee will have an opportunity to ask further questions. We're about an hour and a half into this, and it is a public meeting. So if you can ask your questions quickly, we'll then turn to the public.
Okay, I'll ask one more. I've got others.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And that it goes back to something that Councillor Sanik raised. And I think Mr. Semple knows this well too. If there's not enough parking, quote unquote, as claimed by people, they will blame the city. Okay, I know this, and I'm sure he knows it too. They, one way or the other, will come around to us. But I just wanted to say that. But I'm concerned about a point that was touched on by a couple other councillors, I think, because I know this will come up, and that is the effect on downtown and suburban business of the perception that there's not enough parking. Now, and the ability to attract customers. This comes up with the Downtown Business Association repeatedly over the time I've been on council. And I'm sure staff heard it too. And then they will turn to the public supply. And so I'm wondering what the response, what is the argument against allowing that argument, if there is one? I mean, we can say, yes, like I've said to people, there are parking spots. You just have to look for them, or you have to use the parking, what do you call them, buildings, you know, but convincing people of that, or if they need to store a car, even though they're not using it, that is also something of a problem. So Mr. Semple maybe has a good answer.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So I think as was talked about in the presentation, the changes that we're talking about are of course related to the private supply, but I take your question, you know, that when we're talking about the parking supply, whether it's in the private realm or in the public realm, and that perception and that desire and that the way in which parkers and businesses and others may turn to the city to then fill a gap, even if that gap is a perceived gap. And I guess, Councillor, what I would say on that is, that's why it is so important that that we are actively managing the supply that we have, both on street and off street, and that we are using it in the way that is for the greatest good of what we're looking at. So the on-street spaces, certainly, especially spaces in higher demand areas like the downtown or around our institutions, it's certainly not appropriate for it to be long-term parking for commuters or long-term parking for residential vehicles or storage of vehicles. And our policies, certainly in those closest areas, reflect that in the way that we regulate the spaces and the way that the payment is set up. As we move geographically further out from those demand areas, the regulations change and they start to relax and allow broader types of parking by all members of the public to occur. I guess the reality of that is that as demands increase on parking, or when there are increases in the way in which that parking needs to be used, we would have conversations about what those preferences are. If those preferences are to support commercial and business and other institutional needs for their visitors and their customers, that short-term parking, it's metered parking, and we continue to sort of push those longer-term parkers further out or to other areas, other areas of the city where they then can access our active transportation and our transit networks that we're building. So we make,
we make and are making major investments both in capital infrastructure to support our transit system and our active transportation system, and have federal and provincial funding over the next 6 or 7 years, tens of millions of dollars that will increase the infrastructure that we have and allow us to increase the amenities that are available for those active modes, and provide options that are not necessarily car related and car specific. So we won't be fabricating or magically creating additional on-street spaces or even large supplies of off-street public parking. It will be about using those spaces we have in the best way to serve those goals. And those regulations that we have and the policies that we have can change to reflect that, to support both the land use that we're seeing and the commercial and institutional needs that will continue to exist.
Yes, and Ms. Flaherty.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. So just on the supply of parking downtown, so I just want to reiterate that right now the existing requirements, private developments with commercial and non-residential uses aren't required to provide parking downtown. So traditionally, a lot of the parking spaces that are used are the on-street supply that Ian is talking about. So I don't anticipate that there's actually going to be any non-residential impacts to parking downtown with these changes. From a residential perspective, these changes would actually enable new residential growth downtown, bringing more residents downtown, supporting businesses. So as part of the stakeholder conversations, we've certainly engaged with various business owners, and the Downtown Kingston BIA has participated in some conversations with us. And it's very much received positively that this work would help to enable more residential intensification in that downtown core and helping to support businesses in a way that isn't taking up the existing parking spaces that people who live further away from downtown can actually use those on street and the municipal supply of parking.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Seeing no other hands up, I think we'll go to the public now. So the clerk can take, yes, Councillor Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really quickly, could we have a 5 or 10 minute bio break, recognizing the public will have many great questions and it will probably take a few hours, so it would be many hours.
Yes, we'll take a 5-minute recess and then we'll open it up to the public.
Thank you.
If you, Elizabeth, want to kind of set up the public to ask their questions, that would be great. Thank you very much. We'll call the meeting back to order. Elizabeth, do we have some people in the queue? The public that wish to ask questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do at least have one hand raised at this time. I will, prior to going to that individual, I'm just going to remind members of the public who are joining us this evening, should you wish to speak during this portion of the meeting, we will require you to use the raise hand function in Zoom. This can be located in the center of your screen when you move the mouse across the Zoom window. And Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask Marilyn Birmingham if she would like to unmute.
Oh, hello. This is Matthew Gaventer, by the way. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we can, Matthew.
Hillcrest. First, I want to ask the chair, will we have a chance to make a statement later if we ask a question now?
This will be your one opportunity at this time. So if you want to make a comment and ask a question and do it all within 5 minutes, you're more than welcome to.
So if I understand you, you're saying that this is it. We won't get it. There will not be, usually you have a comment section after a question section. You're not going to, that'll not happen.
No, we always give everybody a 5-minute opportunity to ask questions or make comments.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have to rethink this, how I'm going to handle this. Okay. First, I wanted to say that Vicky Smolka wrote an excellent brief. I hope you've read it, and it's quite poignant. I understand she's not going to be able to be here, so I hope my questions and my comments reflect some of what she had to say. I don't, looking at our experience with the pandemic, it's interesting that the people who took the brunt of it were the most vulnerable of the employees, the gig employers, the big gig employees, people moving from job to job. And it seems to me somehow it's been concluded that the implied, I know, we'll let affordable places can have more or less parking, but there's an implication that the poor don't need cars. And in fact, we're going to build our climate change. We're going to solve our climate change problem on the backs of the poor again. They need cars to get from place to place because they have to, many of them, because they have so many places they have to be at different times. So the assumption they're the ones who don't need parking. And I worry about the implications of the design of this system you're developing, and reflects the comments of Councillor Hutchison, that we're building, there's an unwitting consequence of what you're designing here, that we're going to have a greater discrepancy in wealth. If you're wealthy, you can get parking as you need it. But if you're poor, you don't. The more you can pay, the more you get to use an automobile, the more you get to use an electric vehicle. That concerns me. I do think that and I don't see the justification in preparation for my presentations to the OMB in a couple of cases. I did studies of the consequence of what the effect of vacancy rates are. And I discovered that until you get to 4 or 5% vacancy rate, rents don't go down. Rents go up at the rate of inflation up to around, as I remember my examination, 3.5% of vacancy rate. Below that, rents go up above the rate of inflation. So affordability is not addressed by encouraging developers to develop more. So that Vicky Smolka's comments that the policy does not encourage affordable housing. It does not encourage the developers contribute to affordable housing as a consequence of getting the benefit of lower cost of building. And that's why they're so happy with it, right? That's what hey, this is great. And they are, it's great for them. That doesn't mean we don't need building. It doesn't mean that we should make it costly for developers to build. But the policy has to be balanced, integrated in an effective way. I hope those comments. Oh, yeah. So I'd like to know, I'd like to hear what evidence they have for that justifying trickle down economics, but that's another. But more important, I would like to hear what basis have they determined that affordable people needing affordable housing don't need parking. So that is essentially my question and my comments. I'll try and keep it simple and short. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more hands up, Elizabeth?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Next on the list is Vicky Schmolka.
Excellent. Vicky, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Good. Thank you very much. Little miscommunication with Mr. Ventnor. I was away and wasn't able to engage in a back and forth on what I said. And I sent to him, but I did not submit it to your committee yet. I do have a PowerPoint, though, that I would ask the clerk to please put up. So I can go to the next slide right away. I'll just say that I read the paper and I find there are some very good principles in it, but there are also some real lapses of logic that are quite disturbing and are leading to some very poor recommendations or poor considerations that aren't grounded in fact. I do support some of the elements of the paper, though. One size does not fit all is a good idea. It is true. It is a good approach to parking, and I agree with that. I think reducing parking requirements in a private building must not become a burden of providing to the city of providing parking. And that's in the report, and I agree with that. I think that private buildings must supply their own parking. I think in multi-unit buildings, parking ratios must be on a per bedroom basis, not on a per unit basis. And this was addressed briefly earlier in this meeting, and I don't think it was ever explained why the city could have a per bedroom parking requirement. And I think that might solve many problems. And I would like to know more about why we walked away from that. I think in multi-unit buildings, at least 75% of the parking must be in a garage, not outside. We want to get away as a sustainable city from oceans of asphalted parking outdoors. It has to be underground, or the first 2 floors of a building, or we've seen a proposal where the parking wraps around a 6-story building. However it's done, it should not be outside, taking up a lot of valuable land just for parking. It's not sustainable, and we've got to stop that. And I think every multi-unit residential building must have accessible parking in a covered location, underground or above ground, which goes with what I said before. But this is a disability mobility rights issue, and people cannot be expected who have disability issues to go clean snow after their cars or go to their cars in a pouring rain. They need to be able to access their car from inside. Next slide, please. So one of the things that is good in the report is it talks about supporting active transportation, but where are the facts about bicycle ownership in this city? How many people have bicycles? And I think we know now that almost everybody in the city, like there's a really high percent of bike ownership, and no one is going to leave their bike in that nice slide that we saw earlier in the presentation, stacked up. There was $1,000 bike sitting on a bike rack. You're not going to leave your means of transportation or your expensive recreational bicycle in a storage locker with 100 other bikes. And I think it was mentioned that 10% of bicycle parking will have to be secure bicycle parking, but that is not enough. Everybody needs a secure locker. This is in Las Vegas, an example of an on-street bicycle parking. And it would really cut down on thefts in the city if we could have that kind of parking here. Just please remember, people have an investment in their bicycle, even if they only spent $50 on it. If they're getting around town to get to their job on it, they can't come out of their building or down to the storage room and find their bike stripped or their tires gone or their tires flat because someone's been fooling around. Next slide, please. So this is something that Matthew talked about, and I find this a human rights issue. I think it's appalling that this document suggests that we should eliminate all parking minimums for affordable housing developments. It just doesn't make sense. People who need low-income housing, affordable housing, often work shift work that's outside the, they have to start work early or they finish late. Public transit isn't available to them. They do jobs like house cleaning and go to 8 houses in a day with their mops and pails and rags. So they need to be able to have a car to do that. And they do have a car. What evidence is there that people who live in affordable housing don't need a car? I find it a very disturbing assumption in this report. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Matthew Ventnor has raised this whole issue of how a lower parking minimum will turn into affordable housing. It will not. Mr. Todderan, with all due respect, how can you say that cost savings will be passed on? You were referring to lower cost and medium cost housing. I don't blame builders, but of course, if it's going to cost less to put in a parking space because they don't need to do it, that's part of their profit margin. It's not something that they're going to use to turn into affordable housing. Let's not be naive. Let's figure out a way to use the
60 seconds, please.
Thank you. Use the gap between what a parking space costs, an underground parking, let's say, is $50,000, and get that money into the city for affordable housing, or at least for infrastructure that supports active transportation, which is the suggestion on page 97 of the report. Next slide, please. And I think it's a really big mistake not to include some provisions for excess existing parking. There are a few places in the city, and probably quite a few, that have way too much parking under old zoning. Let's make it easy for those landowners.
Thank you very much. You're now at 6 minutes. Could I ask the clerk to forward to the committee the slide deck when you get a chance? That would be great. Yes, Elizabeth. Is there anybody else with their hand up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There are currently no hands raised. Perhaps we could do another call. I see Councillor Osanik is raising her hand. Perhaps she has an
We'll return to the committee, and then we'll go back to the public for anybody who hasn't spoken yet.
I do have a hand at this time, Mr. Chair, if we wanted to permit public.
Okay, yes, let's do that, and then we'll go back to the committee.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you,
next to speak. Next to speak is Donald Mitchell.
Hello, Don.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
My name is Donald Mitchell, and I live at 43 Gibson Avenue. I'm a resident and a homeowner in Sydenham District. I'm going to cut huge portions of what I was planning to read and bounce around a little, but I'm going to summarize the whole first part to basically say that I've engaged about as much as a resident can in planning since about 2014, maybe a little earlier. And I'm hugely supportive of this. And I think it needs to be recognized, an incredible amount of work by city staff. I know I can speak from 20 or more books that I've read that support this kind of work. I think the Power of Parking document itself lists all kinds of ways that the work is supported. And so I really think it's a question of how we arrange it all so that it best suits everyone. And I'm not suggesting that there aren't always things that need to be worked through, but I think overall, this is definitely where we need to go. And I won't say any more about that. So we need to pivot fast, and we need to promote active modes of travel, and reducing and eliminating car first focus is a must. And now I'm going to be a little bit high level and then bring it home. But if we can come together as a community and grow together as a community, closer together, then there's going to be no better city to live in Ontario, from what I see. And I've lived in, I think, well over a dozen cities in Canada. I was born in Vancouver, Victoria, Edmonton, Calgary, Oakville, Toronto. And so I have a lot of cities, large and small, to contrast this with. But I want to point out that we have a really abundant capacity here. You know, if you start thinking commercial centers, and if we think of those as the focus areas where we intensify and we spread out from there, when you think of the challenges facing that some urban planners talk about, like rural to urban migration, you think about immigration, you think about where we're going to be in 2060, and you look at the last 40 years of wage earners and what has occurred. And now you look forward at the challenges that are going to come up for the next 40 years of wage earners. And I think we have to be really, really careful presuming how we're going to be moving, how we're going to be living. And I think you have to look at, I'm going to go really off sheet, and I'm going to say, you have to look at healthcare and these post-secondary institutions. And you got to say that Kingston has an obligation to have people come to this city, intensify, and live. And I think we need to base those decisions as though we're already there. We're somewhere between 2040 and 2060. And I personally believe this document does that. I want to raise, how do you measure success? I don't know if Mr. Todden will know this or not, but I would measure success by 60 West Cordova Street in Vancouver as an example that Kingston should strive for. I'm going to quote from a book, Citizen City. The city of Vancouver also required agreements legally restricting and protecting the purpose of the 12 units sold at cost to PHS and Habitat for Humanity. So 18 parking stalls with 2 for car share programs was a minimum level of parking that did not meet the existing parking bylaw at the time. It was $40,000 to $50,000 in savings per stall, lowered the cost of the units. There are 96 units in the building. They went from 75 feet to 100 feet. And that's how I'm going to measure success of this. If the city of Kingston can bring all the different partners together and realize the affordable housing that Matthew's talking about, Vicky's talking about, Councillor Hutchison is talking about, and I think it can be done, that to me is what's going to be worth it. I personally don't feel, and maybe in the next public meeting I'll talk more about this, but I personally don't feel that this parking piece is actually going to solve affordability. I agree with the others, but I do think there's a piece there for negotiating. So I'd like us to look at hubs. I'd like us to look at mechanisms to do the negotiations to take the existing parking and share it more evenly through people. It might solve Sydenham District if Queens stopped hoarding and opened up some of their supply. And the final piece is that I think that speaks to that is the Shoup quote, where he says each of these policies supports the other two. And he's talking about dealing with on-street, off-street,
30 seconds, please.
Reinvestment in the community. And I think I'll leave it there, but if I convey nothing else, I hope that I convey to the committee and other members of the public that I really support this, and I congratulate staff and the City of Kingston. This is backed by a whole bunch of city work from walk and roll and beyond. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I will now open it up for members of the committee to respond to some of those questions or comments that were made. And then we'll see if there's any other members of the public at that time with a hand raised, and we'll go back to the committee at that time. Yes, Vice Chair Kylie.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just wondering if you wanted staff to have comment to the public's questions. And
that's what I just said. I just said.
Sorry, I thought you said committee. I misheard. My apologies.
No, I'm sorry if the committee will go to after staff have had an opportunity to.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. Sorry, my apologies.
Thank you. I may have misspoken. Yes, Ms. Flaherty.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, let me just grab a drink of water here. So in response to the original comments, so the question about on what basis have staff used to determine that affordable housing projects don't need parking, I think it's really important to reiterate that the work that we're doing is not saying that affordable housing developments don't need parking and that people who live in affordable housing developments don't need parking. That is not at all what the intent of this work is. The intent of this work is to ensure that the parking that's provided for affordable housing developments is appropriate for the needs of those developments, and the city dictating those needs to the providers of the affordable housing. They know their clientele and they know the number of spaces that they need to provide much greater than the city does. So when we provide an artificial minimum that requires them to provide an extra 10 spaces at a cost of $400,000 to $800,000, you know, it's a really difficult thing for us as staff to say that that's a justified cost that should be borne by the tenants of that building and that development. So it's certainly something that we're very sensitive to, and we are certainly not intending to say that affordable housing projects should not have any parking spaces, period. It's really providing that flexibility and providing the right number of parking spaces so that those costs aren't passed down to the tenants, so that the housing can be more affordable. In our experience and background working with affordable housing providers and developers, the most of the feedback that we receive in that regard is that developers don't make money on parking. They charge what they're paying for parking, but it is not a moneymaker for them. They're not in the business of making money off of those spaces, and it's certainly just costs that they're directly passing down. So I think when it comes to affordable housing, it's really important to recognize that when we're talking about the relative costs related to land values, construction values, parking, when land values might be lower and the construction might be lower, parking remains the same. And it really is, relatively speaking, a higher cost for those types of units. So I think that was a piece that I wanted to specifically speak to. I will pass it over to Paige, and perhaps I'll follow up with some additional comments after Paige.
Yes, Ms. Agnew.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Certainly I echo Laura's comments. So certainly if there's been any kind of misunderstanding that what we're saying through this parking paper that introduces a number of ideas and preferred options is that the way that we strategically manage parking is like unequivocally going to address the whole issue of housing affordability in the city. That is not what we're claiming at all. What we're saying is we're trying to make sure that people have the understanding of connection between parking regulations that are forcing applicants to build more parking than they require based on the fact that they're outdated. And those do have costs associated that get built into the process. And what we're trying to do relative to encouraging good infill development in the right places, again, at a variety of prices within the housing continuum, is how could we learn from what we've been doing over the last 5 or 6 years working on specific projects. And I can say with certainty that the last 6 or 7 projects on affordable housing, the most recent one being 1316 Princess Street that this committee heard, and the one before that on Bath Road, in every one of those examples, working with housing providers, we are consistently seeing requests from the 1.0 minimum requirement that's stated in our zoning bylaw right now down to 0.6 or 0.5. So what we were evaluating is why would we continue to force housing providers in multi-res situations, especially that are focusing on affordable housing projects, to be held to a standard where consistently, again, to Laura's point, and knowing their clientele and who they're building housing for and what their needs are, that those two don't correspond. They don't meet anymore. So while we're saying that we're suggesting potentially as an option to eliminate a parking minimum for affordable housing, it's in no way saying that people that live in any type of affordable housing don't require cars. That's just not something we're saying. What we're saying is let's make the standard reflective of what we've seen over the past 7 to 10 years consistently on affordable housing projects and eliminate an artificial boundary or a limitation on that project that in multiple circumstances actually impacted the floor plate of the building, which had we done it back then, we could have been seeing a larger building footprint with more units that otherwise was spent on surface parking. So this is what it's about, is evolving that conversation based on our experience, working with those housing providers, looking at what they've been requesting and making sure that we're not requiring something artificially that's requiring someone to overbuild beyond what we've seen has been required in multiple projects over time, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And there were some other questions and comments that were made by other people. If anybody on staff would care to comment on them.
Just one more quick comment. Certainly, you know, in working on this project, and it is in the parking paper, Laura specifically worked directly with master students from the CERT program and working on some of the detailed background information and recommendations. So there was collaboration there. Our cash in lieu of parking bylaw, the way that it is right now, and that's one of the pieces that we're also suggesting that we eliminate going further so that there isn't this city requirement to take a reduced amount based on the cost of building per space, which I believe in our bylaw is $3,000. And then that is tying the city to requiring to provide that private development with a space on a go forward basis. We don't think that that is something the city of Kingston should be doing. We believe that private development should be providing its own parking supply. But within the bylaw, the way that it's stated and the way that that has been used, I'm not even certain, and this is something that we can do some more research on, but you can't take something that's a cash in lieu of parking payment and then just redirect it to a whole nother form of development. There has to be a relationship between the money that you're taking and what's being provided. Now, where there could be opportunity is looking at community benefits, which we're exploring a new strategy in 2022 as part of changing what we're doing to make sure that it's consistent with the provincial direction. But it's not quite that simple of saying, give us money for a parking space and then we can translate that into a housing fund. The money has to be kept very specifically and it's documented in terms of its expenditure, and then we have to report out on that. That's part of like the framework of how the bylaw works. Laura, I'll leave it to you to add some additional comments.
Thank you. Ms. Flaherty, followed by Mr. Todderan.
Through you, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to touch base on the comment from Ms. Schmolka related to the per bedroom parking requirement. So part of the work that we had done, we had actually engaged a BA group to take a look at the parking ratios for multi-unit buildings based on a bedroom requirement rather than a per unit. So some of the work that was done predated the current restrictions that council had enacted on the number of bedrooms in those lower density forms of housing. I think it's really important that to note that we haven't made any recommendations about units over bedrooms. Our current preferred option is to do it on a per unit basis, simply because we think that the amendments that we have made through the bedroom limitations, combined with the amendments that we will be making in the Central Kingston Growth Strategy area through that work, address the concerns that led to that discussion in the first place. We think it's really important to recognize that a per bedroom approach doesn't necessarily equate to the exact right ratio either. It's not a silver bullet that is going to solve the right supply for the demand. So you might have a single detached house that has 4 bedrooms in it, but there might actually only be 1 or 2 occupants in that house, and there might be one car, there might be 0 cars. Whereas you might have a unit that has 3 separate units, and if it's done on a per unit basis, the ratio might be significantly lower than the actual demand. So it's certainly one way of regulating parking, but it's in a similar way to doing it on a per unit basis. It's not a perfect response, and it's not a parking is certainly not a science, not even close to being a science. So to require a more complex system to address a problem that I believe is going to be addressed through the work that we're doing on the new zoning bylaw project, I don't think that the costs at this point in time outweigh the benefits that we would get from doing a more simple approach to parking.
Thank you. And Mr. Totter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Just three other points that I think were brought up in questions. There was a question or a comment that went along the lines of how can you say, Mr. Totterin, that the savings were passed on automatically in terms of affordability? Just to reiterate that I don't think I did say that. I think I said that it was fairly complicated in terms of how that relationship works. But in general, that removing costs associated with parking does support affordability, but it's not necessarily one-to-one in terms of parking spaces. So you can go back to my previous answers to hear what I said. The comments about the bike security, I actually, and particularly the notion that as bikes get more expensive, if there isn't a good approach to secured bike parking within buildings and in the public realm outside of buildings, people will just want to take their bikes, expensive bikes, up to their units. I think we couldn't agree more. This is the first foray that a municipality like Kingston will have, in our observation, in mandating a certain minimum level of secured bike parking. Frankly, the case could easily be made that this isn't enough, but it's also recognizing that that Kingston would be breaking new ground in terms of this kind of requirement. So if you asked me, is it enough? I could easily conclude that it's not, but making this requirement would be a new thing in the context of regulations and incentives for a city like Kingston. So I think we tried to set an initial level that we considered both ambitious but reasonable. If council wanted to be more ambitious, I think in the context of secured bike parking, we could certainly take that direction, and I think the facts would support that. Lastly, the comment about the example that was given in Vancouver, and I'm almost loath to talk about Vancouver examples because it just feeds the narrative that, oh, this is something that big cities do, which isn't particularly helpful for this discussion. But the example 60 West Cordova that was given by the last speaker, this is actually the project itself, and this is the book that the fellow was referencing. I was actually the chief planner who negotiated this project, and the key, I think there's an important point to be made in referencing this project. There was a great deal of flexibility built into the zoning that allowed the dramatic achievement to happen without doing a rezoning. And the critical component in that negotiation and that very successful, highly lauded project is that it had to get done without a rezoning. And I think that's useful to say out loud because that's basically the spirit of a lot of the work we're doing here, providing that flexibility, requiring affordable projects to happen in a way that the providers want to need without having to go through the expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain process of rezoning. And so 60 West Cordova, no matter what city it's from, is actually a good example of what you can do when you've got that flexibility built into the zoning, which in a large extent is what we're talking about in this exercise. That's it, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other staff wish to comment? I think we just about covered it. Elizabeth, are there any other members of the public with hands raised?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not seeing any hands at this time. However, if we could do a final call to ensure that there are no further comments or questions, for those who are joining us this evening, if you could please raise your hand in Zoom should you wish to speak to this file.
Great.
No further hands, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we'll go back into the committee, and I know we jumped out of committee when Councillor Hill, Councillor Hutchison, and Councillor Osanek had raised a hand. So we'll go back to those people. I see Councillor Hill is chewing something, so I'll go down to Councillor Osanek. No? Okay, Councillor Hutchison, did you have anything further to say or questions to ask?
I don't actually, because some of the questions were answered in the response to other questions, and I get a better idea. Are we at comments, or are we still in questions?
Yeah, you can make comments or ask questions
Oh, yes, because we're
at
coming.
this time.
Okay, sure. So I would just encourage staff. I want to make it clear that that there's a number of really good things here, and considerations and thoughts. I think we cleared up some concerns, which are predominant in the minds of many of the public. But the issue of flexibility, the concept of flexibility, Mr. Todden was talking about earlier, perhaps that could be clarified when this comes back again, and what the benefits are. I think that people sometimes wish there was, if not a silver bullet, at least 2 or 3 brass bullets, so I can see the logic of setting a lower minimum, and at least that's what I take it to be here. And what I see here is that this is a polished change that will yield a limited systemic benefits, hopefully. So I don't want to minimize it too much, but I'm just contrasting that with the kind of hopes that people have and the sense of desperation, I think, around housing and affordability and the different ways in which that's manifesting itself from the mid-range to the homeless. So I think that's what drives many of the comments. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I apologize. I live a block away from a fire hall, so that was the siren going off in the background. Any other members of the committee wish to make comments or ask questions? Seeing none, if you could take the chair, I just have a couple of process questions.
I do, and I recognize you.
Thank you. Laura or Ms. Flaherty or Commissioner Agnew, I know this is a non-statutory public meeting, and I really appreciate that we've made this available both for the committee and for the public. I believe we have a statutory public meeting and an open house that are coming up later this year and early in next year. Could you clarify that, and where, and then it'll come to the committee as I understand it, and again the public will have an opportunity to make comments or make recommendations, and then it goes to council. Am I on the right path?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, you're certainly on the right path. So the current project timeline, we're intending to release the second draft of the new zoning bylaw, the entire new zoning bylaw, not just the pieces that we've talked about here tonight, this summer. So we are planning to have basically 2 rounds of statutory public meetings, where the first round would be in early fall, so likely in September, where we would have a statutory public meeting on the second draft of the new zoning bylaw at Planning Committee. As a follow-up to that, we're also going to be requesting to schedule a special meeting of all of council to have a follow-up conversation with all members of council. So at the planning committee meeting, it'll certainly be a similar format to this, where members of the public can provide comments, and there would be no formal recommendations at that point in time. Throughout the fall, we'll be receiving a number of comments from the public on the documents itself and through other methods of engagement. And then leading up to our final recommendations in early 2022, we'll lead into a second round of statutory public meetings, which will start with a statutory open house at least a week before a statutory public meeting at planning committee. And that would be where staff are making final recommendations in the form of a comprehensive report on the overall new zoning bylaw project. And then members of planning committee would have the ability to consider our recommendations and send those recommendations off to council.
Thank you. And I think having this as a special planning committee meeting with a single agenda item, I think is really beneficial. So I know it means we add another meeting to our busy schedule, but I think that that's a much better approach. So.
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you. We're certainly working with all of the various planning managers and Mr. Park, the acting director of planning services, to ensure that we're appropriately managing the agendas. So I think at this point in time, we're looking to dedicate one of those meetings, the regularly scheduled meetings, to the first statutory public meeting in the fall. So it wouldn't be a special meeting of planning committee, but it would be a dedicated meeting for that event.
Great, I appreciate that. So I think I jumped in there when I didn't have the chair.
You can have the chair back.
Thank you. Last call, if there are any other comments or questions that members of the committee have. Yes, Councillor Hutchison.
Sorry, there's a couple of things I should have said. I just want to make it clear that I appreciate the report, and I think the minimum parking requirements being changed is an overall benefit, and it does subtract from the effect of the car over time. And staff are trying to find a positive move that they don't have to go out too far on the limb to see what the effects are, and I can appreciate that. The other thing is that the comments that Commissioner Agnew made about affordable housing, I realize it comes back to me that I had developed affordable housing, and her comments are entirely correct. I know in my own experience, we had to meet certain parking requirements. I think we got a minor break of some sort. But, you know, when we were done, 6 of the 8 houses did not have cars, or more, probably 7 of the 8. You still have to have room for visitors, otherwise they're impinging on the parking you've already got. So it gets a bit tricky. And, you know, parents visiting and the normal things that people have. So, but if you can subtract from that successfully, then it could affect the type of amenities that you're able to afford on small projects, and as she said, maybe on large ones, something, you know, an extra unit or something. So I just want to make it clear that I understood that argument and I can endorse it. So what I see from this is that we're looking for benefits that may benefit landlords, but we're also looking for the benefits to the public at large, and trying to find a constructive middle way at this moment that'll get us closer to our strategic priorities. And as I said before, and certainly other people said, there's no silver bullet. Hopefully we've got something, you know, a silver arrow or something, maybe. We'll see. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Seeing no other hands up, I will request a motion to adjourn. Oh, Paige has her hand up. She's not allowed to move adjournment, but
Sorry,
go ahead.
Mr. Chair, just wanted to make sure that that you remembered we also have to deal with tiny homes and shipping containers.
Oh,
So
I'm sorry. You're
another
absolutely right.
staff presentation to come.
apologize.
Yep, no problem.
3 hours and too many hours yesterday. We had a council meeting till midnight last night, so I apologize. Yes, we'll go on to the next topic, and we'll give the public an opportunity to speak to it as well. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, everyone.
You're welcome.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll try to keep this presentation shorter, recognizing the time, and allow for more public comments and questions to really direct some of the additional feedback beyond what we've already provided in the discussion paper. So moving on to our final discussion paper, we can get into tiny houses, shipping containers, and additional residential units. So as a reminder, for those of you who may have missed my earlier introduction, my name is Laura Flaherty, and I'm a project manager and planning services on the city's new zoning bylaw project. Next slide, please. So there are a few different topics that are covered by this discussion paper with very specific intents. So firstly, we are proposing to implement the new provincial legislation, which requires municipalities to allow for up to 3 additional residential units on properties that currently allow for up to 2 second residential units. So secondly, we are proposing to replace the current definition of garden suite in the official plan and the zoning bylaw with tiny house, and amend the new zoning bylaw to clearly recognize and plan for portable tiny houses in the city. And finally, we're proposing to include shipping containers in the definition of building in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw to ensure that there is explicit clarity with how repurposed shipping containers are regulated from a zoning perspective. Next slide, please. So before we get into anything, when it comes to residential uses in zoning bylaws, it's really important to clarify the distinction between principal units and accessory units. So principal units are the main residential units on a property. So for properties with, say, a single detached house, a semi-detached house, a duplex, it's either the single main unit in a single, or for those duplexes and semis, it's the 2 principal units within those buildings. Accessory units are completely separate from the principal units. They're typically in a smaller detached building that might be located in the rear yard, or they're in a basement apartment, or as an addition on the main building. So in 2019, the City of Kingston amended our current official plan and the existing zoning bylaws to allow for accessory units to be permitted for most detached, semi-detached, and row houses. The accessory units are currently called second residential units, and these permissions aligned with the language in the Planning Act that was in effect at that time. So second residential units are currently permitted as an accessory unit that's either attached to the principal unit or as a detached standalone building in the rear yard. The current permissions allow for 1 principal unit and 1 accessory unit per property. And there are a number of zoning bylaw requirements that apply to second residential units, such as height, setbacks, lot coverage, parking, the construction of a pedestrian walkway to access the unit, etc. Next slide, please. In addition to the performance standards that I just listed, second residential units are also not permitted in areas right now where there are specific constraints. So we look at sewer or servicing capacity limitations, water supply or quality constraints, or where there are sewer surcharging constraints. They're also not permitted in natural hazard areas like a floodplain. Next slide, please. So one of the purposes of this discussion paper is to talk about the changes to the Planning Act and how we're required to implement them in the new zoning bylaw. So in 2019, the More Homes, More Choices Act, which it amended the Planning Act to remove that former second residential unit legislation and replace it with new additional residential unit legislation. So the new legislation requires municipalities to allow for up to 3 residential units where 2 were previously allowed. So this means that a property with a detached, semi-detached, or row house can have 1 principal unit plus up to 2 accessory units. And the legislation specifies that the 2 accessory units would mean that 1 is attached to the main building and that 1 would be detached from the main building. Next slide, please. So the intent of the additional residential unit legislation is to create more opportunities for more housing in the city. The legislation may help to address the housing crisis by providing more opportunities and more housing options and options for more affordable housing. It increases housing opportunities where infrastructure already exists without the need to expand costly services and facilities. It also allows for the intensification of built up areas of the city, which helps to relieve the pressures of urban sprawl, protecting local agricultural lands, employment lands, environmentally and culturally sensitive areas. Next slide, please. So since we're passing a new zoning bylaw, we're required to permit the additional residential units. So the discussion paper that you have before you tonight proposes to allow for additional residential units where we currently permit second residential units. The intent would be that the same restrictions that currently apply to second residential units would then be applied to additional residential units, including all of the same performance standards and the same constraint areas. This means that the basic change would be that instead of just allowing 1 accessory unit, we're allowing for up to 2 accessory units, of which 1 can be attached to the principal unit and 1 can be detached from the principal unit. So the only exception to the rule is parking, which we obviously covered by the last discussion paper. And in that discussion paper, the current favored option is to continue to require a parking space for the second residential unit, which we currently require and we allow to be provided in a tandem configuration, but not require a parking space for the third unit that might be provided. Next slide, please. So let's talk about tiny houses and how they're connected and different from additional residential units. So according to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, a tiny house is a small, private, and self-contained dwelling unit with living and dining areas, with kitchen and bathroom facilities, with sleeping area, and it's intended for year-round use. So globally, this definition is reflective of a larger tiny house movement, which is a popular trend in providing more affordable housing and encourages a simpler living arrangement in smaller spaces with less consumption. Some people consider tiny houses to be houses that are built to be portable or on a trailer chassis, like the photo that you see, while others consider tiny houses to be any house that's small. So I think when we're talking about tiny houses, different people have different ideas about what it really means. So in the context of a zoning bylaw, it's really important to make the distinction between tiny houses that are designed to be portable and those that are designed to be permanent or built on a foundation, like a traditional house. As the Planning Act is really specific in what we're permitted to regulate in the zoning bylaw. So it essentially says you can regulate the use of land and the construction of buildings. It doesn't say that you can regulate portable houses. And then in doing so, it includes a couple of specific sections, which give us a little bit of permission about these portable types of buildings. So I'll get into that detail in a second. So the final element I wanted to speak to on this slide is really the distinction in the zoning bylaw beyond permanent versus portable is really whether the tiny house is the principal unit or the accessory unit, like we had talked about with the additional residential units. So next slide, please. So for portable tiny houses, the language that's in the Planning Act, it includes a specific section, which includes a definition of a garden suite. So essentially, the Planning Act says that a garden suite is a 1-unit detached residential structure containing bathroom and kitchen facilities that is ancillary to an existing residential structure and that is designed to be portable. So the Planning Act, in creating this additional way to regulate these portable units, gives very specific requirements, and it only allows municipalities to allow garden suites where a site-specific temporary use bylaw has been passed to allow them. So the intent of the work that we're doing, and that's before you this evening for a public meeting, is to suggest that we change the terminology in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw for these portable tiny houses to be called a tiny house, which is the modern language that the majority of people who are asking us about tiny houses actually use, rather than the garden suite language, but ensure that the provisions for tiny houses are aligned with that garden suite definition in the Planning Act. Next slide, please. So where do permanent tiny houses fit in if there are people who consider tiny houses to not just be restricted to the portable type of tiny houses? So when we're talking about permanent tiny houses, they really are connected to the additional residential unit language that we were talking about. So a permanent tiny house, when it's an accessory unit, would be the same as a detached additional residential unit. So the second draft of the new zoning bylaw would allow for permanent tiny houses that are accessory units under those detached additional residential unit permissions. The one additional element that I wanted to speak to very specifically is that when we're talking about permanent tiny houses, which would be the principal unit on a lot, so the main residential unit on a lot, it's simply considered the single detached house, and from a zoning bylaw perspective. So the one suggestion that we've made as a recommendation to include in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw is to amend the first draft. The first draft had carried forward some of the historic residential requirements in different areas of the city. And some of those requirements actually identified a minimum dwelling unit area. So it essentially is, you must build a house that is at least this size, was some of the requirements that were carried forward in the first draft of the new zoning bylaw. So the suggestion that we've made through this discussion paper is to remove any of those minimum dwelling unit area requirements for those principal units, and to allow people, if they wanted to build a smaller house or a tiny house or whatever size house that they want, they should be permitted to build, and we shouldn't be dictating the size of someone's house from a zoning, the minimum size of a house from a zoning bylaw perspective. Next slide, please. So I know that this is a rather complex topic to navigate given the permissions that we have in the Planning Act when we're talking about tiny houses. So I've provided a chart here that essentially gives all of the terminology that would be included in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw and connects that terminology to whether it is the principal unit or an accessory unit, and whether it's a permanent structure or a portable structure. So this specific table can be found on page 13 of the discussion paper, which is page 173 of the agenda. And rather than me going through this in detail, I'll just point everyone to this table in that document. Next slide, please. So changing gears now, let's talk about shipping containers for a couple minutes. So shipping containers are obviously large metal containers like the ones that you see in the photo, and they've been designed to very specific international standards to ensure their portability and the easy transfer between different modes of transportation. So they're essentially designed for multimodal moves where they might go from a cargo ship to a transport truck, or a cargo ship to a train to a transport truck, depending on what part of the supply chain that they're in. So historically, shipping containers have been used for the transportation of goods and the loading and unloading of shipments at their destination or at their point of origin. So the expansion of the global supply chain and the high cost of moving empty containers back to their original locations have led to a recent surplus in shipping containers. And the surplus has kind of led to new uses for shipping containers in both rural and urban contexts, including long-term storage, conversion into habitable buildings, sometimes even tiny houses, and conversion into commercial storefronts. So shipping containers, they have a lot of benefits from a construction perspective. They are sturdy, they're watertight, they're relatively inexpensive, and that's especially true when you consider them against the cost of alternate construction methods like wood, when they're experiencing such a high price increase like we are currently going through with wood right now. So next slide, please. So when we look at shipping containers from a zoning perspective, they've presented challenges since zoning bylaws typically define buildings and structures to be permanently attached to the ground. So shipping containers are inherently designed to be portable only when they're moved with large equipment that can handle the substantial weight. So they're not easily portable, but they're designed to be portable with the right equipment. So the trends we have seen where shipping containers are reused for different purposes is that they're often placed on the ground for more or less a permanent location, since getting the specialized heavy equipment to move them isn't really an easy thing to, or a cheap thing to do. So when they're placed on the ground in this manner, shipping containers have led to the same land use planning impacts as buildings. So they might negatively impact neighboring properties. They might create line of sight concerns. They may contribute to stormwater runoff issues when they're not sited properly on a property. Next slide, please. So to provide clarity and to address the current ambiguity surrounding the use of shipping containers, the discussion paper proposes to include shipping containers in the definition of building in the second draft. So what this really means is that when a shipping container is placed on the ground for any purpose other than loading and unloading a shipment in conjunction with an industrial or commercial use, it would be subject to all of the same provisions that apply to buildings in the zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Chair, for questions and comments from members of Planning Committee about this discussion paper.
Thank you very much. The floor is now open for any members of the committee that may have questions or comments. Yes, Councillor Hutchison.
Is this on both tiny houses and shipping containers? Okay. So I noticed, and correct me if I didn't get this correct, but basically you're restricting tiny houses to existing properties with a residential structure on them. Would that be correct? As accessory uses.
Yes, Councillor.
Speaking to Ms. Flaherty.
Sorry, I demoted you. Ms. Flaherty.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So a tiny house, when we're talking about the portable type of tiny house, which is the way that we're proposing to define it in the new zoning bylaw, it would be limited to being an accessory unit where additional residential units would be permitted. So you can build a tiny house that's portable as a detached unit in a rear yard in all of the same locations that you would be able to put in additional residential units. So with single detached houses, semi-detached houses, and row houses, which is what the legislation says for us. And it would be required to additionally have a temporary use bylaw passed, because that's also what the legislation says. So we would have to go through a site specific process to allow for that to happen in everywhere across the city. But those would be the locations that we would direct them through that process.
Okay, so if someone had a lot and they wanted to build one, or I'll say more, but that I want to get the one down first. They wanted to build one tiny home on it. Would they be allowed to do that? They're not an accessory at that point. So I'm just trying to figure out what all is allowed here.
Certainly, through you, Mr. Chair. So the Planning Act allows us to regulate them when they're accessory units. So right now we're limited to what the Planning Act permits us to do. And in addition, we need to consider the official plan policies that are related to mobile homes. So once we start talking about principal units that are designed to be portable, but they're more or less permanent when they're actually placed on the ground, we have to very carefully consider the context of the mobile home policies of the official plan, which is very clear that mobile homes are only permitted in one existing mobile home park, and they're not permitted to be established in the remainder of the city. So right now, the intent of the language is very clear and very restrictive. So through this work, we are not looking to introduce the portable tiny houses as a principal unit because of the policy and legislative restrictions that we have in that regard.
So I take from that in crude terms, the answer is no. Okay, you're sort of nodding there. Okay, I just wanted to know what was, and I don't have very real. I think what I heard here, it sounds fine. And then you indicated here that, okay, so you have the mobile ones and you have to deal with them in a certain way, and they're related to mobile homes policy, and so you have to work through all of that on a site-specific basis. Okay, good. I'm glad you're nodding. The so permanent tiny houses, which are an accessory to an existing home, and could be attached or detached accessory, correct? So you said that now we've removed the minimum size. So what I want to know is, why did the minimum size exist? What pros and, I guess I get the cons, but tell me, what are the pros and cons of that so I can think about what you're telling us?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the existing zoning bylaws are very old. So they're from the 1970s, and they're predated by zoning bylaws that are from the 1940s and 50s. And the restrictions about the minimum dwelling unit sizes are very, it's a very different approach to planning than what we take in the city right now. So it really was about ensuring that houses in single detached neighborhoods were all the exact same size and the exact same type of people lived in those neighborhoods. So they were not inclusive. They were very, very exclusive. They did not care about equity or housing affordability or ensuring that we have complete communities. So when we're looking at that type of policy, it's certainly not reflective of the values that we have as the city of Kingston or in our current planning approach citywide. So they certainly aren't reflective of the direction that we want to go, and ensuring that we're encouraging all types and sizes of housing in neighborhoods, and not restricting specific houses because they are quote unquote too small to fit in with the rest of the neighbors.
Right. Okay, that's good. That was a really good answer. So essentially we're saying, and I'm being facetious here, that if you want to live in a closet, that's up to you, right? So, okay. So thank you. Well, I might have a question later about the shipping containers. I got to think about that. Okay, thank you.
Great. Any further questions? Yes, Councillor Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. Sorry, I realized a moment ago that my camera's off. I've been here all night listening intently, and I want to build on a conversation that I had with Ms. Flaherty this morning, and she did address some of what I'm going to ask, so forgive the repetition, Ms. Flaherty, but for the benefit of the public who is here, and just for the record, when we talk about portability, and again, recognizing this was in your slides and even some of your answers just now, how do we define it in the sense that a lot of tiny homes, from my experience, frankly, friends who have built tiny homes or companies in Kingston that build tiny homes are often on wheels, even though they aren't intended to move. It's just a matter of the structure and the way that trailer bases can be used as foundations. So if they're on wheels, is it a portable unit or not? Or can you play that out for us?
Certainly, it's a really challenging definition from a zoning perspective. Obviously, it's something that we've grappled with the shipping container topic as well, something that's inherently designed to be portable, which is designed to be moved. So I think when we're talking about portable tiny houses that are on a trailer chassis, when there are wheels connected to it and it can be easily attached to a trailer hitch and moved, that's something that from a zoning bylaw perspective is considered to be portable. I think, Councillor Kiley, what you had alluded to our conversation earlier today is are there any opportunities to allow for that design of tiny house to be considered permanent in the context of the zoning bylaw? So I think whether wheels could be removed from it, would we consider it to be a permanent house on a property at that point in time? And I certainly think that's something that we can explore. I'd like to engage in some additional conversations with my colleagues in building services to have some detailed conversations about that in the context of the Ontario Building Code and what we can do from a zoning bylaw perspective. So that is work that I plan to do leading up to the release of the second draft, to see if there are any opportunities to allow for the zoning bylaw to consider that type of design in a permanent way on a property rather than being a portable use. So
yeah, fair enough. I think that would be helpful. And I also wonder, related to that, if servicing is brought to, whether it's a shipping container or a tiny home that happens to be built on a trailer, would that also perhaps impact the definition if it's structured into city services in a way that would make it highly unlikely, if not impossible, to move?
Through you, Mr. Chair, from a building code perspective, I know that there are certainly specific requirements when a building is attached to services that the building code treats them as a building. So I think it's something that we can explore as we have that conversation with the building department to see if there could be some type of tie-in to that definition in the zoning bylaw.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Any further questions? Seeing none, would you take the chair?
I do.
Thank you. I know I asked this earlier today, but just so it's on the record, all of the requirements for setback, lot coverage, all of those things that normally go into a secondary suite would also apply to tiny houses on a lot. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, that's correct. The approach that we're proposing is to wrap the detached additional residential units and tie those into the portable tiny house requirements as well. So where they're located on a lot, they have to comply with the setback and height and lot coverage requirements in the same manner.
And I know Councillor Hutchison asked a very good question about the rationale for when we had minimum floor plate for, and I think that happened in a lot of suburbs as a way, it was a very bourgeois approach, a way of maintaining a kind of class structure. Like it made housing much more expensive so people couldn't move in. And in some areas, there was also a racist component to it as well, historically. So I'm very pleased that our new zoning bylaw will not have that archaic idea there. So I'm also a little concerned though, because tiny houses, I know in some communities in Ontario and elsewhere, have been used as an approach to try to alleviate homelessness. And if it's only going to be recognized as an auxiliary building, doesn't that limit it? I'm thinking, I win the lottery, I buy a lot, I want to put 3 tiny houses on it. Can I claim one of those as primary residence and the other 2 as auxiliary structures?
Through you, Mr. Chair, so right now under the legislation that we have, you couldn't put 3 portable tiny houses onto a lot under that tiny house permission. So I certainly recognize the number of applications and consultation we have related to tiny house communities, which is really another mechanism of sharing costs and further decreasing the cost of the housing units. And I think it's important when we're talking about a citywide zoning bylaw that we need to consider that zoning bylaws are generally meant to apply to the property fabric that exists right now, maybe with some modifications to it. But when we're talking about developments at a scale that there might be multiple services, what's the actual movement around the lot in that type of community? It's really important that we get that right. And from a citywide zoning bylaw perspective, we don't have the ability to look at the site-specific constraints that we need to consider to ensure that there aren't any major human health and safety hazards or concerns, land use compatibility issues as we're planning tiny house communities. So I think when we're looking at as of right permissions on a citywide basis, we have to be very careful and ensure that they're appropriate and they're scaled with appropriate levels of development. And any of those, that type of community would be subject to a site-specific application and conversations with planning staff where we can ensure that all of the bases are covered and we're helping to support the appropriate development of those lots.
We'll continue this conversation when I win the lottery. So that's all the questions that I had or comments. If you could return the chair. Excellent. It's now open for any other member of the committee to ask questions or make comments. Yes, Councillor Hutchison.
Okay. Back to, okay, on the homeless issue, a couple of things. The shipping containers. Are we looking at these in a different, as a possibility to addressing homelessness? I know there are issues with pods and fires and how efficient the containers actually are. Like one of the thoughts that comes to my mind is, does this work where you need winter insulation and it doesn't have any windows? And just how safe are these things? Are we looking at that? Or, I mean, or not, you know, where's that with the department?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the zoning bylaw is not the appropriate place to dictate construction techniques of buildings. So essentially we say, this is what our building can be, and these are the setbacks and these are the heights. And when we actually get into the construction techniques of buildings, that's really a conversation through a building permit and under the jurisdiction of the Ontario Building Code. So from a zoning bylaw perspective, we're saying it's a building, and it can be used for any other purpose that you can use any building for on your lot. So if you're in a residential zone and you're permitted to have a single detached house, from a zoning bylaw perspective, if you want to put a single detached house in a shipping container, it's a building to us, and all of the details about the construction techniques that go along with that building would be subject to the building permit process.
So it would have to meet all the other conditions set out by other departments.
Right.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay, so and the same goes for tiny homes. That's why I got your quite good answer to Councillor Neal. That's what I took from that.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes. The tiny houses would obviously be required to comply with all of the building code requirements, any of the servicing, utility, electrical requirements from all of our partners in the various departments of the city.
And so the issue of how tiny homes would work in terms of addressing homelessness, if we thought that would work, would be subject to the housing department and whether they thought it would be a good use of resources. And the thing I'm mostly concerned about is if you've got the land, you should probably be maximizing its use. So, because it doesn't come along every day. Okay, so, but in terms of the zoning bylaw and planning, we just want to get it, you just want to get it defined properly so that you can deal with the planning aspect. Okay, fair enough, thanks.
Thank you. Seeing no other hands, I'll now go to the clerk. Do we have members of the public who wish to weigh in on this?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do currently still have 11 members of the public with us this evening, and I currently have 3 hands raised. So I will begin at the top of the list with Matthew Gaventer.
Thank you. I was hoping not to go first. Maybe someone else would ask these questions. Anyway, I only came up with this question listening to the discussion because I am very supportive of the idea of tiny homes. But I was thinking, if I understand correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong, or you will. Thank you. The 3 units, one of them has to be lived in by the owner of the property. If that's correct, we were thinking in the affordable housing community a bit about being able to buy 3 or 4. Okay, there are developers buying houses, building units into them, and for speculative purposes. But we were thinking that if we could get 3 or 4 homes within a short distance of each other, if we had 3 units on them, and we could really provide affordable, the units at an affordable price, that would be a way of getting a foot into affordable development. But would that not be allowed in this? Is that contrary to what you're thinking of, or what is being proposed here? Thank you.
Your next on the list is Marilyn Birmingham.
Is that Marilyn or is that Matthew again?
I believe this should be Marilyn this time. We'll double check.
No problem. Hello, Marilyn.
Yeah, thank you for taking for letting me speak. I'll be very brief. I was very, very happy to see that tiny homes was coming up to planning. I've been working on affordable housing for a number of years. I was on the development board of Kingston Cooperative Homes, where Rob retired from few years ago, I guess now. And I was involved in the other co-ops when they were being built, the other two. And have been knocking my head against the wall for many years since funding isn't available easily and land is an issue, of course. But I was very happy to see that you were finally considering tiny homes. They have been allowed in other jurisdictions. I gather from what you were saying, it was the province that were holding you back, and I know they've been available in jurisdictions in BC for some time. Anyway, that's my comment. I just am really happy to see this. I read through the report. I didn't get a chance to really go through it in detail, so I may have some comments at a future meeting or in writing, but I'm glad you're moving forward on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And is there one other hand raised? Elizabeth, or?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we actually have 2 more hands at this
Excellent.
moment. So next on the list is Crystal Wilson.
Hello, Crystal. The floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you for allowing me to address you this evening regarding report number PC 21042, tiny houses, shipping containers, and additional residential units. Last night, City of Kingston Council received the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan, which included a recommendation to create a housing development action plan for the full housing continuum, citing a growing need for a range of housing. The plan included a need to increase supportive and affordable housing options, to research and develop alternative and affordable housing strategy with specific attention to the needs of older adults, and to explore tiny home communities with hub models. While the report addressed the need for affordable housing for seniors, for those receiving social assistance, and those experiencing homelessness, we also need to ensure we have adequate, affordable, and attractive housing to maintain and grow Kingston's workforce. If nothing else, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us how very important it is to take care of those who take care of us. Across Ontario, we saw the struggles of those who couldn't afford to stay home, were unable to isolate due to overcrowded housing, couldn't afford to take sick days, didn't have health benefits, and who put the lives of themselves and their families at risk in order to keep our economy and healthcare systems functional. We saw a dramatic increase in rent arrears and subsequent evictions for workers whose employers were forced to close. And we saw a 36% increase in the average price of homes in Kingston. A person working minimum wage in Ontario has a net take-home pay of approximately $25,000 per year. A rental search website, Zumper, indicates the average monthly rent for a 1-bedroom apartment in Kingston right now is $1,344. As someone who helps people find housing, I can assure you that a person would be fortunate to find a healthy 1-bedroom apartment for that price. A recently celebrated new development launched with bachelor apartments costing in excess of $1,800 per month. The people who do the heavy lifting in our economy and take care of us are forced to either spend more than half their take-home pay on rental housing or crowd themselves into unhealthy living conditions. People earning less than minimum wage through social assistance, old age security, or pensions which haven't kept up to the cost of living are in an even more precarious housing position. In 2017, now CAO Hurdle identified the need to address the looming worker shortage in Kingston. In 2019, the worker shortage was discussed again at a Chamber of Commerce event. And as we attempt to recover from the pandemic and reopen the economy, Kingston employers are identifying shortages of healthcare, tourism, and hospitality workers. Kingston's worker shortage will only grow if essential workers continue to be priced out of housing options. Environmental activist David Suzuki noted in 2008 in his Green Guide about living more sustainably that house sizes have been increasing while the size of our families are dramatically decreasing, leading to environmental trouble. We have been building bigger and bigger houses to store stuff rather than people. Our generations may not have heeded this warning, but our children are more environmentally aware, are taking our climate emergency seriously, and are looking for options for simpler living and reduced environmental impacts. This has sparked a new movement of tiny homes, shipping containers, and innovative small home solutions. Our children are more selective in choosing the communities where they work and play. And now with the pandemic-induced shift to working from home and worker shortages across Canada, they can be choosier. We can politely ask, and send motions of support to upper levels of government for income tools like increased minimum wages, increased social assistance, and universal basic incomes. But as a municipality, we can't directly increase the wages of those who support us, or those who need our support. What we can do is try to ensure that those who earn the least can live affordably and with dignity within our community. We can do this by meeting the recommendations of the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan and Council's strategic plan goals, and adjust our definitions of the types of places our community members can call home. In discussing report number PC 21042 to define and support tiny homes, shipping containers, and additional residential units, we have an opportunity to be creative and stretch the smaller end of the housing continuum. This is an opportunity to decrease indirect discrimination in Kingston's zoning bylaws and build more inclusive neighborhoods. What I am asking you to consider tonight is to lift the ban on mobile home communities and/or consider definitions and regulations which could accommodate micro homes, cottage-style housing, and cluster housing, which may have some municipal infrastructure accessed in a separate communal building. With housing options like this, we can increase Kingston's affordability, workability.
30 seconds, please.
I welcome your questions and comments. Thank you.
Well timed. Thank you.
I can
Elizabeth, are there any other hands up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do still have another further 2 hands. Would you like both to be able to go now, or would you like to take a break for staff to address?
Let's address the questions that have been asked up till now, and then we'll go back to the public. So, Ms. Flaherty, the floor is yours.
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you to everyone who's provided comments so far. So, Mr. Gaventer, in response to your question about the whether the person who owns the property has to live in the unit in order to have an additional residential unit or a tiny house, the answer is no. So in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw, we will be bringing forward revised definitions to residential units to ensure that we aren't people zoning and dictating who can live in different types of residential buildings across the city. So as part of that work, we're ensuring that there are no references to the owner of the property being the person who lives in the unit in order to have these permissions. So if a property owner rented out the principal unit and had an additional residential unit that's either a tiny house in the backyard or in as a basement apartment attached to the principal unit, they can do that. And it's certainly not something that we're regulating from a zoning bylaw perspective. Ms. Birmingham, thank you for your comments. I'm happy that you've received this report positively and that tiny homes are something that you've been waiting for in Kingston. And Ms. Wilson, certainly thank you for all of your comments. I think all of the points that you've identified are items that we're actively trying to grapple with in the new zoning bylaw, and your suggestion to lift the ban on mobile homes, that's certainly something I can take back and have additional conversations with the department about that. I don't think there were any specific comments for me to respond to in a number of those submissions.
Thank you. The floor is yours, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Next to speak is Vicky Schmolka, followed by Donald Mitchell.
Hello, thank you very much. Vicky Schmolka, River Park, 702 Newmarket Lane. I forgot to do that last time. I just want to say I fully support tiny homes. I think it's a very good move to help the city deal with its affordable housing crisis. I believe I heard Ms. Flaherty say that the official plan prevents us from having homes with wheels, and I think that is something to review. I know in some of the other zoning review work that's being done, there are going to be changes to the official plan, so perhaps this is another area where an official plan amendment is appropriate. The other thing I'm concerned about is minimum standards. I do support this. I think it's an excellent direction to go, but just a quick Google search says that there is an international residential code for tiny homes, and they have to be at least 120 square feet. They have to have one habitable room. They have to have at least one closet and one window, and there has to be a 7 to 8 foot ceiling height. And I didn't quite catch what Ms. Flaherty said about this, that it's sort of not the concern of zoning, but I think it has to be the concern of zoning to set some minimum standards. And I would like to hear planning staff's thoughts about what happens with tiny homes might get translated into multi-unit residential buildings, and whether there are any concerns that we're going to be creating a kind of substandard style of housing in multi-unit buildings. Like how do tiny homes fit with the overall housing picture for the city, and what thought has been given to that? And I don't want that comment to be seen to be anti-tiny homes. I just think from a policy perspective, it would be good for council to look at this as a whole picture, and how does it all fit together so that we ended up with a desirable city with enough green space and enough community space and appropriate housing that's mixed housing, because as we know, housing ghettos don't work either. So thank you very much. Those are my comments.
Thank you. And Don, you're up.
Hello, good evening again. Donald Mitchell, 43 Gibson Avenue. Again, I'm going to truncate a lot of what I said. I was very intrigued by, I think it was 2 speakers ago that spoke to actually something that a large portion of what I've written was really about. So I have 0 issues really with the zoning bylaw aspects of this generally. The report mentions a range of affordability. I doubt, other than when you know someone, this is going to deliver a lot of below market rate housing. And I remember the chair of the Mayor's Task Force on Housing indicating that the issues with particularly tiny homes and shipping containers is the scale up aspect. And I thought that speaker had a very, very interesting concept. So my concern really is that this city is really highly susceptible to those increasing pressures by a diversity of investors who are speculating in Kingston that this is a good place to store your money. I mean, that's the issue. Rental housing, buying houses, great returns. So I don't see a lot of this happening in some of the really core areas, because anytime a house comes up for sale, particularly in Sydenham District, you're competing with the third aspect of this, which is additional residential units. And we know from the grant process with the city, very few people take them up on the affordable housing option, because what they do is they maximize that second and that third unit, because you can get an awful lot of money off of one demographic. So the shared efficiencies piece and finding a way to compete is what I think that the city really needs to investigate in this. And I think that we have to be very clear about what's going to deliver affordability. And there are movements now in Vancouver and other places that are really looking at taxation and other methods to try to drive land values down and to really try to bring in affordability in other ways than just using density, because density isn't really delivering affordability. And the scale up aspect of this isn't really practical in many ways unless you actually allow multiple properties to find efficiencies and we deliver more of this, or you start investigating very intriguing proposals to do with what was suggested about mobile homes. So in general, I support this. I just don't know that it's really going to deliver a lot. And I would really like the city to investigate that aspect of how do we compete with investor money in our core areas, because you don't have a fighting chance with any of this unless you solve that problem. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And any others, Elizabeth?
Mr. Chair, I don't see any further hands.
Okay, if staff would care to comment on those comments.
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you, Ms. Smolka, for your comments. As far as the minimum standards are concerned related to the size of tiny houses, it's certainly something that's regulated by the Ontario Building Code. So the Ontario Building Code has specific requirements when we're talking about the interior size of tiny houses versus a traditional house. So from a zoning bylaw perspective, the zoning bylaw is looking at land use compatibility. And when we're talking about the human health and safety and ensuring like a safe living condition, that's under the jurisdiction of the OBC. So that's something that would be reviewed through a building permit application under the building code, not from a zoning bylaw perspective. When Ms. Smolka, you had asked about hearing planning staff's thoughts about tiny houses getting translated into multi-unit residential buildings. So I'm not exactly sure what that comment meant, and I'd be happy to have a further conversation with you offline to ensure that I'm not providing an answer that's not addressing your comment if I misunderstood it. But I think the intent of the zoning bylaw work related to tiny houses is that tiny houses are permitted for the low density forms of housing. They're not permitted for that multi-unit, larger scale housing forms. I think one of the recommendations of the Mayor's Task Force on Housing for the multi-unit, when we're talking about housing affordability, is looking at opportunities to allow for co-living units within those multi-unit buildings where, you know, maybe there might be multiple private spaces that have a shared kitchen or bathroom facility. So that's certainly work that we're undertaking as part of the new zoning bylaw project, and something that we'll be consulting with the public on when the second draft of the new zoning bylaw is released. But it's not directly connected to this tiny house work because it is a separate piece of work that is for those multi-unit residential. So Ms. Smolka, I certainly apologize if I missed the point of your comment, and I'm happy to have a further conversation with you about that if I have. Mr. Mitchell, thank you for your comments. I don't think that there are any specific questions for me to answer. I think a lot of the comments go beyond the scope of the zoning bylaw as we talk about a broader affordable housing strategy. I think overall in the new zoning bylaw, we're certainly trying to find all of the ways we can to encourage housing affordability. And that's providing a range of housing types and options for residents in locations that haven't traditionally been provided in the past. So certainly it's always on our mind as we're creating zoning provisions, and specifically in the context of the new zoning bylaw. And I don't have a silver bullet to address the housing affordability crisis, because if we did, I think it would be addressed by now. So it's certainly something that informs all of our work, and we will continue to work towards providing better zoning provisions that help housing affordability in any way that we can.
Thank you. So Elizabeth, all members of the public that wished to speak had an opportunity.
Mr. Chair, there are still no hands at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll return to the committee then. Any questions or comments from the committee? Seeing none, would you take the chair for one brief comment?
I do, and I recognize you.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I applaud Laura for bringing forward a proposal for shipping containers. That's very brave. In all honesty, I wouldn't want to be Councillor Hill the first time somebody proposed a shipping container in Lakeside or in Sydenham District or in Portsmouth. I have seen some very tastefully refitted shipping containers that are coffee shops and restaurants and burger places near parks in Toronto, and I think they can be very tastefully done. There are challenges though, and so good luck, Councillor Hill. So that's all I had to say.
Good. You can have the turn.
Thank you. So, seeing no further comments or questions, so I believe that's the end of our discussion tonight. It's been a mere 3.5 hours, so hello, Elizabeth, did you have a comment?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to ensure that once we do call this meeting to a close, we still do need to go through our regular meeting protocol just to approve the agenda as well as
Yes.
the addendum.
Yes,
Thank you.
of course. We can't jump, as I was trying to, right to adjournment. I just have to find the right piece of paper. I apologize. Here we are. So we will go to the special meeting one. I'll call this meeting to order, which we've already done. Approval of the agenda, which has no action on it, but would there be a mover? Thank you, Councillor Osanek, seconded by Councillor Hill. All those in favor? Carried. Confirmation of minutes. We have none. Disclosure of pecuniary interest. I see none. No delegations, no briefings, no business. Motions, notices of motion, other business, correspondence. Date of the next meeting, Thursday, July 8th at 6 p.m. Now is the time to adjourn. Who would like to move adjournment? Thank you, Councillor Hill. That was quick. Seconded by Councillor Osanek. All those in favor? It's carried. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to bed.